The Redeemed, a prequel of The Light of Darkness by Catrin Russell, narrated by Jez Jameson. Chapter 1. Jewels. Skinny as a damned broom handle, and probably equal to one in weight. That's what he was. All he was. The only downside to his constitution was his height, which had literally gone sky high in the last few scorching hot summer months. His recently lengthened limbs had made him increasingly clumsy, the youngster often underestimating his reach and subsequently ruining his chances as he ventured out to procure valuables. But this time he couldn't afford to fail, no matter what. Raven would be furious. Scaling the outside wall of a 3-story building, Edric moved swiftly, hands and feet successfully gaining purchase along the rough surface. The lack of rendering was an unexpected advantage, helping him keep up his pace. Any non-essential second spent on climbing up the exterior of a structure such as this risked him being seen, or worse, getting caught. He worded a silent prayer to the goddess of holy light. Perhaps she would listen. Or maybe not. As the youngest member of a thieves' band, his were the lowliest of assignments. Petty theft and burglary, filching, pickpocketing, the occasional evening of a score, and so on. Yet he had done it for nearly as long as he could remember. This year he had turned 15, or was it 16? In truth, he wasn't entirely sure. The soft sole under his right shoe slipped, a breath catching in Edric's throat. Gravel dislodged from the grout between the stone blocks of the building, trickling down to the cobbled street below. Ignoring the swirling debris, Edric looked up, seeing the thatched roof and the dark clouds beyond. He was so close to his target, the window at the very top. That was where his objective was meant to be found. A bag of jewels of such quality its sheer value stood to outrival those of the Queen herself. It couldn't possibly be true, of course, yet, even if the jewellery fetched a mere fraction of the potential price at the black market, it would be worth the effort. Clamping tired fingers to the windowsill, Edric heaved out a relieved breath. The window was still open. A quick survey of his immediate surroundings, and Edric was satisfied. He remained undetected. Hauling himself up, he vaulted through the unconventional entrance and landed silently atop a layer of worn floorboards. Blonde hair whirled before his eyes, but he swept it away. Edric took stock of the room. A small bed in one corner, a chamber pot beneath it, a wardrobe to the far left, then an elegant dresser just next to the door leading out. He stood before it in no time, his heart racing as he began sifting through the contents of every drawer. It had to be in there. He knew it. But where? Shirts, underclothes, belts, and more flew across the room behind the thief, yet no jewellery purse emerged. With the dresser empty of contents, Edric stood back. He needed to hurry. He didn't have long in a place like this. No room ever remained vacant at a famous inn within the upper district. A sharp cry had him jolt in place, his hand instantly responding by grabbing hold of the knife at his belt. He left it in its sheath, waiting. There was a moan, then another. A series of muffled bangs followed, and a round of deep grunts. Bile rose in Edric's throat, but he swallowed it down. The wench in the next room likely had another customer. Returning to his assignment, Edric did a quick search of the wardrobe, yet it yielded no more results, and he was forced to reassess his options. What had he failed to see? He stared at the dresser, knowing, feeling it was there. Something seemed amiss. And there it was. The bottom drawer doesn't come as far out as the rest. Kneeling, Edric ripped the drawer clear. It had indeed been shortened, hiding a rear compartment. He thrust his hands inside the piece of furniture, fumbling in search of anything within. His fingers connected with a soft material, smooth like worn leather, and he clutched it, yanking it clear. The pouch felt heavy, the contents rattling in his hand, but he had no time to go through it all. He needed to leave. Rolling to his feet, Edric took one step before the door flung open. Layered skirts swished, and a middle-aged lady dressed in a gaudy gown and tight bodice entered, a man in tow. The so-called wealthy matron, no doubt, and whatever customer for whom she was about to perform. She recoiled at the sight of the masked, darkly garbed youngster standing in the middle of the room, and stumbled back into the man behind her. Like a deer poised to run, Edric stood hunched, legs wide. He held his knife in one hand and her purse of jewellery in the other. "Guards!" the matron shrieked at the top of her lungs. Edric rolled the knife in his hand, about to threaten them to stand aside, when the man behind her lumbered past. Well over 6 feet, with brawn to match, he wore a gambeson emblazoned with the king's royal emblem, a shield adorned with swirling patterns. Shit, a royal knight, of all things. A sword cleared its scabbard, singing free from its confines, the tip of the blade soon pointing in Edric's direction. "Let go of the knife," the knight rumbled. Edric's weapon felt terribly inadequate, and his throat clenched. Where could he go? Jumping out the window, tumbling 3 stories down onto a cobbled street was certainly no option. He took a step back, but the knight pursued him, swinging his sword out in a wide arc. Edric dodged and rolled, the move inching him closer to the door and towards his only chance at freedom. "Guards!" the matron squealed again, turning towards the doorway in what seemed an effort to fetch the deaf sentries. She shot down the hallway, disappearing out of sight. Thrusting his weapon out, the knight buried it in the wardrobe, barely missing Edric as he yet again skittered away. The wood groaned as the hulking man retracted the sword, renewing his attack by slashing down on the bed. Feathers whirled into the air from the lacerated bedding, yet Edric remained unharmed. The door was within reach. Spinning on his heel, he bolted and ran, sparing not a single glance over his shoulder as he flew down the hallway, vaulting across the railing of the first flight of stairs, then doing it again with the second. He landed on the floor of the main hall of the tavern, the space rammed with customers and guards alike. The sentries milled past the many tables and chairs, heading in his direction. Edric had no other choice than to face them head-on. The matron stood screaming amongst the guards, cheeks flushed beneath bulging eyes. Pointing in his direction, she initiated their charge. Edric swallowed hard, sprinting forward. How she had managed to gather so many men in such a short amount of time was beyond him. But this was no time for pondering. He needed to act fast. At least they weren't royal knights, and the one from upstairs had yet to catch up with him. Seizing hold of a chair, Edric used his built-up speed to hurl it overhead, sending the first guard crashing to the floor. Edric's knife sliced a long gash across the hand of the sentry behind him, causing the guard to lose his grip on his weapon. The sword dropped, clanging against the floor. Edric danced through the group of guards, parrying sword swings, rolling under lunges and clearing a table before he finally reached the front door. Drinks had been spilt along the way, leaving customers swearing, but he pressed on. The door was already open, and, with a tight grip on both knife and jewellery pouch, Edric dashed into the night. The taste of iron laced Edric's tongue, his coarse breath grating in his chest each time he exhaled. He needed to stop, to give himself a minute of reprieve. But where? He could still hear the distant sound of clinking metal and shuffling boots, a thunder of footfalls echoing along the streets and thoroughfares. He was still being pursued. A warm sensation inched down Edric's side. Patting a hand against the area, he could feel the familiar soaking of liquid underneath. His palm came away stained with blood, visible in the light from the many torches lining the street. One of the guards must have landed a lucky blow in the flurry of swords and daggers. Edric needed to get away from the upper district. There were too many sentries and way too many royal knights. Acting as the king's elite soldiers, the knights were known not only for their immense skill in combat, but also for being strategists and scholars, often leading other men as officers within the army. It was even rumoured they could single-handedly fight against demons, able to thwart the beast's fear-inducing auras. The knights were therefore essentially the perfect warriors, well versed in everything, and thus a great danger to anyone with a shadier type of profession like Edric. A sharp turn saw Edric scurry down a side street, and he arrived in a back alley behind another tavern. The business seemed less frequented than the one he had fled, as there was not as much noise buzzing from within. Finally able to slow down, Edric tore his mask clear, drawing his first unhampered breath in almost an hour. Rolling the black fabric into a ball, he stuffed it down one of the many pouches attached to his belt. The leather strap around his waist was twice wrapped, yet still held plenty of excess length, the flap at the end tucked into his trousers. Despite the dank smell of the alley, Edric enjoyed the almost fresh air as he strode along at a resolute pace. Waste of every kind littered the passageway, but he positively ignored it. He was accustomed to all types of muck and refuse by now. The thieves' band had been staying inside the Ravenna capital city for almost 3 months, ever since the start of summer. The change of scenery had been strange at first, as they were used to the great outdoors with its forests, fields, and rivers. Throughout the years, the mercenaries had travelled all over the Midlands and its many provinces. Rover and Becua were often frequented, and, of course, Ravenna, where they currently resided. Creatures of habit, the haunted shadows and their leader never ventured far. But desperate times had befallen them. Feeling the side of his belt again, Edric made sure the jewellery pouch was still there. He passed several buildings, soon emerging out onto a market square, the stands readily closed for the night. In the middle of the plaza there was a bronze statue of King Kenneth Urchinwine, dressed in a full suit of armour. He held his sword aloft, a foot planted on the head of a growling wolf demon. A sunken pool stretched around the statue, water squirting from the demon's mouth and neck, like some sick attempt at making it seem as if it bled in every direction. Edric had never liked the damn thing. The sculptor had also striven to recreate the swirling mists that often spawned around demons, but it didn't quite purvey the right effect. Edric shivered at the mere thought of such a monster, his last encounter with one only a year earlier. 2 men had died before the members of the Haunted Shadows managed to subdue the beast. Granted, they had been ambushed, but still. Demons did look like animals, big cats, bears, wolves, and whatever else shape they transformed into. Yet they were anything but. Edric often wondered what they really were. Corrupt humans? Spawns of darkness? No one really knew. Rubbing at his brow, Edric frowned. He had not once seen the king in combat gear, but he supposed the continued peace within the Midlands and its neighbouring countries likely served as a reason for it. The same argument was given as the motive for the Haunted Shadow's current lack of employment, at least by Raven. Loping across the square, Edric stopped by the edge of the pool, dropping to his knees. Cupping his hands, he scooped water up and splashed it against his face, rubbing the dirt away. He worked diligently, ending the procedure by brushing his fingers through his hair. It was becoming much too long, and another mat seemed to be forming at the back. Retrieving his knife, Edric made quick work of the tangled lock, throwing it to one side. About to stand, he felt his legs wobble and slumped back down. He swore, sheathing his blade before bracing himself against the edge of the pool. "Are you all right?" came a soft voice from behind him. Edric half turned on the spot, faced with a young woman staring back at him. She wore a gown with a voluminous skirt, the fabrics vibrant but worn. He wasn't sure if he had seen her before, but by the looks of it, she was probably one of the more pricey whores of the upper district. His eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. "I'm sorry if I disturbed you," the girl went on, "but I thought you seemed a little unsteady." "I'm fine," Edric muttered, leveraging himself upright. It was times like these he was happy about his low weight. Any heavier a build, and he would have fallen flat on the cobbled ground. "Oh, you're so young!" the woman exclaimed as the light of a nearby torch hit his youthful features. "Let me help you." Before Edric could deny her offer of aid, she stepped towards him, her hand connecting with his arm. He lurched backwards with the touch, falling awkwardly into the pool. Bringing a hand to her mouth, the woman gasped, "Oh, I'm so sorry. Please, let me help you." Edric thrashed in the shallow water, slipping on years of built-up silt at the bottom. "No!" he shouted. "Disgusting wench! Don't you dare touch me!" He twisted around, grabbing hold of the statue to push himself up onto his feet. He cleared the edge of the pool, then bolted down the other side of the square, leaving the woman behind. He needed to hurry and return to the lower district to deliver the jewellery at the Dirty Swan Tavern. "What took you so long?" Raven snarled, snatching the jangling pouch out of Edric's hand. The bald man had risen at the sight of the youth, but now he merely scowled, his eyes dark with suppressed anger. Two massive hounds flanked his chair, their black fur bristled across their backs. "And why are you wet?" The ceaseless din of music, chattering, laughing and shouting nearly drowned out the question as Raven slumped back down onto his seat. The smaller hound sank to the floor, yet continued to stare at Edric. Raven's crew of thieves, or mercenaries as they preferred to be called, were all gathered around the nearby tables. With them having rented most of the rooms at the inn, the ground-floor hall of the tavern had turned into their home. The building was nowhere near as illustrious as the inns of the upper district, but it was all they could afford. The main hall of the building stank of stale ale, piss, vomit, and whatever else could come out of a human body. I was nearly caught, sir," Edric said, stepping back. Water dripped from his clothing as he hung his head. Despite being nearly the same height as his leader, his posture drooped, shoulders rolling forward. "And I fell into a fountain." The mercenaries chuckled around them. "Needed a bath, did ya?" one cackled. Ignoring his men, Raven emptied the contents of the pouch onto the table, pieces of gold and silver rattling down together with a few gems of various colours. Raven glared at Edric, clenching his teeth. "Is this it?" It is, sir." Edric clutched his wrist, the spindly joint still aching from his previous physical exertion. A sudden lug to his shirt sent him reeling, and he came crashing down onto the table, the pieces of jewellery caroming across the wooden surface. "Is that the truth?" Raven hissed, pressing Edric's face sideways against the table. He grabbed a knife from his belt, stabbing it into the wood a hair's breadth from the youth's eyes. "Or did you pocket the rest, you little shit?" Both hounds came to their feet, and one barked, its lips curled over its fangs. "I wouldn't! I swear!" Edric forced himself to stay still, as any movement risked worsening the situation. The smell of alcohol assaulted his nostrils, Raven's hot breath much too close for comfort.
You'd better not lie to me, pretty boy.
Another bark, stringy saliva sent dripping to the floor from the larger hound. Edric stared at Raven's knife, the deep blue of his own irises reflected on the polished steel. I've never lied to you, and I never will. That's all I could find.
The matron wasn't as rich as we thought,
another man at the table chimed in. His long hair was pulled back, gathered at the nape. He ran a calloused thumb along his stubbled jawline.
Your informant scammed us,
he directed at Raven.
Shut up, Einhard,
Raven snapped, retracting his blade, then waved it at the man.
Don't you think I bloody well know that? I will gut that goddess-damned son of a bitch.
The hounds yapped in unison, Raven immediately turning to shout at them.
Shade, Dusk, shut up!
They whimpered and silenced, slumping back down. With Raven's knife still pointed at him, Einhard raised his hands in surrender.
Just saying.
Gripping Edric's hair, Raven jerked his head back, sending him sprawling onto the floor. He clutched one of the necklaces on the table, dangling it before the other men.
This won't even cover the tip-off,
he grumbled, dropping the piece of jewellery back down. Reaching into his pocket, he retrieved a copper coin, then pinged it at Edric.
Get yourself something to eat, boy. I've got another assignment for you. I'll have my vengeance. Tonight!
Chapter 2. Misfortune. Despite the late hour, the Dirty Swan Tavern bustled with people. Raven's crew remained gathered, most of the members unsure how many drinks they had so far downed. A man sat forward, leaning onto his elbows atop Raven's table. His auburn hair was cropped short, and his hazel eyes were focused on their leader. "You sure he'll manage?" he inquired. Raven glowered at him.
The boy will be fine, Mason.
Placing a soft hand on one of his hounds, he gently stroked its head.
He's more vicious than he looks.
Mason blinked, unsure if Raven meant that the boy or the dog was dangerous.
But he's old enough,
Raven snapped, his hounds partaking in the argument with a growl.
Stop questioning me, or you'll be out of the haunted shadows faster than old Dusk here can castrate your sorry ass.
Mason wrinkled his nose, only glancing at the dog. A male of substantial size, Dusk flashed a row of sharp ivory teeth, one of his bottom canines broken in half. He was the more vicious of the two, with Shade, the female, at least somewhat amicable. They were both black, with short fur and broad heads. Their big ears hung low, and long claws adorned their massive paws.
Another month, and you might have learnt to shut up,
Einhard mocked, draining the remainder of his drink. He sat beside Mason, gifting him a venomous smile.
That kid's a danger to everyone around him. I'd rather take Raven's dogs for company.
Dusk gnarled louder, eyes gleaming. A danger! Mason seemed unconvinced, shooting a hesitant look at the beast. Raven chuckled, leaning back in his seat.
You need to keep the pretty boy on a short leash, even more so than my dogs. Otherwise, he might slit any one of our throats at night.
Scratching Dusk behind the ear, he then patted him on the shoulder.
You'll see. That informant is as good as dead.
No matter how many seconds, minutes, hours, or days he spent in the lower district, Edric still balked when passing through this hellish, deplorable low-caste layer of society. However, even within the region, separate areas would be known as more or less atrocious. The foulest streets were those spanning from the very centre in a thin line all the way to the outermost curtain wall. Homeless men, women and children littered the alleyways, and the cobbled streets had transitioned into packed dirt, often covered in inches upon inches of filth. Edric didn't care to know what he was treading over as he traversed the district, heading to where Raven's informant was meant to reside. He only wished he had remembered to change into his boots. Reaching the very last street, abutting the 40 feet high and 15 feet thick curtain wall, Edric turned right into a narrow thoroughfare. He leapt across a water trough outside yet another tavern, wondering why in the darkened hell anyone had thought a man rich enough to own a horse would frequent this area. Perhaps there were more criminals along these streets than Edric had initially thought. With a quick glance, he determined he was on the right track, reading out the name of the tavern in his head, the Golden Cockerel. At least, that was something for which he could thank Raven, perhaps the only thing, namely being able to read. He had been taught it was an essential skill if one wished to be anything more than a lowly thief living on the streets. Although, looking at the haunted shadows and the situation they were currently in, Edric wasn't so sure his reading skills had made much of a difference. A building, 2 stories high, with 4 oddly shaped windows on the front wall, came into view. It was precisely as Raven had described, and Edric settled into a walk. The informant was supposed to take up residence there. Named Matthias, the man was an older gentleman and once a successful thief himself. But these days he merely sold information, enabling others to perform the heists he would have once committed himself. Edric reached over his shoulder, feeling the quiver of arrows on his back. He swiftly counted them. 13. Even if the old man managed to run, Edric would soon land a killing blow. His only problem was remaining unnoticed on his way back. Murdering someone with a bow and arrow was usually silent and effective. However, should someone catch him in the act, he would be hard-pressed to explain away carrying a composite bow in the middle of a city. The handle of his bow felt smooth in his hand, his fingers rapping against the leather-wrapped belly made from a goat's horn. The weapon was like an extension of himself, sleek and lightweight, at least for someone of his build, rangy and thin. Edric had speed with a sword, but not enough strength as of yet. A puddle of murky water splashed under Edric's foot as he stopped below the wonky-windowed building. He looked down, his face screwed up. Was the liquid something else? It had felt awfully warm beneath the sole of his shoe. Sidestepping away, he shuddered in disgust, flicking his foot. But he would have to clean his shoe later, for at this moment he needed to take up position behind the house and wait for Matthias to emerge out the back. That was where he always sold his more or less useful information. Then again, if the man exchanged faulty intelligence for coins, why would he return to the same spot? He was well known in the area and seemingly trusted by so many. Had Edric botched his assignment by failing to find all the jewelry available? What if he were about to murder someone only due to his own inadequacy as a petty burglar? Edric shook his head. This was not the time to think. He needed to act. Running down the side of the building, he arrived at a small, dark courtyard. Matthias angled forward in his tattered armchair, the once luscious velvet lacking any signs of its long-gone, high-quality pile. Long rips flanked the sides of the chair, and the piece of furniture groaned dangerously as the man shifted atop the flattened seat cushion. A candle flickered on the round table beside him, its wax burnt low. It needed replacing, but it would have to wait. Matthias licked his fingers, pinching the wick to smother the flame. He had a last meeting for the night, then he would retire. Perhaps for good this time. He was getting too old for this life, with the dangers brought by his constant contact with criminals. He had enough savings hidden away to live out the rest of his days contentedly. Maybe not in the luxury he once had, but comfortably enough. At the very least, he would invest in a new chair. Rising from his seat, Matthias reached for his cane propped up against the side of the table. He tapped his thumb on the hooked top, then moved it in close, placing it snugly alongside his right leg. Ever since the last attempt on his life, Matthias had walked with a bad limp, the knife wound never correctly healing. The area would become infected time and time again, then scar over to gradually improve, but the pain would never abate. With a grunt, Matthias took his first hobbling step towards the door, then another. Only a few more paces, go out and back inside the door, then he would return to his armchair and, hopefully, enjoy the rest of his night in peace. Grabbing a lantern hanging by the exit, Matthias trudged out onto the back courtyard of his home, his eyes searching the shadows. He was always careful, ever since being assaulted by that cursed knife. Life in the lower district had never been easy, especially in times of peace, contradictorily enough. No war meant fewer soldiers, increased city populations, lack of employment, dwindling resources, and decreased standard of living. The king might have been known for his peace and prosperity, but for whom? Matthias sighed. It mattered not to him, as his life outside the law would see him taken care of, albeit alone. Another companion was never something he would ever enjoy. The ashes of his late wife already spread into the wind to be brought back to the goddess. 12 years unaccompanied, and many more to come. The sound of a tiny pebble scooting across the courtyard had Matthias look up. Amongst the shadows of the far corner, a silhouette appeared, tall and slim, black clothing merging the figure with the lightless backdrop. Matthias's eyes narrowed. "Are you Ogden?" he demanded. No answer came, a sudden glint in the distance reflecting the light from his lantern. "No knives," Matthias cautioned, "or you shall have no information." The figure stepped closer, and the sound of wood creaking and talking whispered through the courtyard. He held a readied bow, an arrow resting on his finger, pointing it at Matthias. "You lied about the jewels!" All the colour drained from Matthias's face. Who are you?" He felt sweat breaking through the skin on his forehead, watching the stranger take another step. The light from Matthias's lantern hit the face of a young man, no more than in his mid-teens. He was a handsome boy, surprisingly fair for someone in this line of business, but his eyes were dead, not an ounce of emotion hinted within them. A flat look locked with Matthias's stare, and the stranger wouldn't deign to reply, posing a question of his own instead. "Where's the rest of the jewels?" Matthias swallowed, but it made no difference to the state of his parched throat. "The matron's jewels?" He received a mere nod for an answer. I don't know where she keeps them all. I only know she has plenty." "Not enough," the youth stated. "You stole from Raven." "I did not," Matthias rebuked. "Look, I'll pay him back." "You have any coin on you?" the boy interrupted. "Inside my house. Let me just—" A hiss went through the air, ending in an ominous thud. Matthias shook violently, his lantern crashing to the ground, and the world transitioned into perpetual darkness. Raven sat back, slamming his jug onto the table. Mead sputtered over the edges of the pitcher, foam running down the brushed metal. The darkness outside the multi-paned mullions of the Dirty Swan Tavern was absolute, but the leader knew the first rays of the sun would soon creep across the rooftops. Killing an itch between his legs, he adjusted his package. "If only the King of Tilia could oblige and die," he muttered, glaring at his neighbour across the table. "Young kings always have to prove themselves." Einhard returned his glare. "Oi! The prince will be dumb enough to attack.
given a few years to gain authority. I heard he was found reading a book upside down.
He finished with a chuckle, elbowing Mason beside him. Mason gave him a sideways glance.
At least he can read. What's that supposed to mean?
Einhard challenged.
I've been fine without the skill.
Mason raised an eyebrow.
But you make fun of another lacking it. Get over yourself, farm boy. Or are you about to try and teach nearly 40 of us how to read, perhaps?
Raven snorted.
Some of us already know how to, you simpleton. It'd be awfully hard to follow written instructions unless I could bloody well read them.
Einhard opened his mouth to word his retort when another man at the table sat forward.
About that,
the man said, green eyes peering at Raven.
You heard anything from Dog? Why do you always have to interrupt me, Gavin?
Einhard complained, mead sloshing in his pitcher as he waved it at the man. Raven ignored all attempts at arguing, his voice unnaturally calm.
No, I haven't. But I'll probably send him another message soon if I don't. We've got to do something. Find employment somewhere. Staying in the capital obviously isn't working.
But what's his crew doing that ours isn't?
Came the follow-up question, voiced by yet another man down the table.
Ha! Really, Ian?
Einhard grunted.
Can't you see I'm trying to make a point here?
The so-called unnamed have their name.
Raven huffed, again disregarding his henchman's effort to change the subject.
They've a steady stream of filthy rich clients. And even if they didn't, I bet they've got enough coin to go into hiding for the rest of their damned lives.
Teeth gritted, Einhard stood, slamming his hands down on the table. Raven immediately rose to meet him, furiously whacking his metal jug across the man's face. It connected with Einhard's jaw, his head snapping back and his eyes rolling up into his skull. He crumbled down into his seat, shattering the chair with the impact, and ended up sprawled on the floor. Panting, Raven scowled at the unconscious man, his shoulders drawn up and hands trembling with fury.
Just shut up, you worthless piece of shit! For once, take your own damned advice,
he roared, hurling the empty pitcher straight into Einhard's head. He didn't react, already out cold. Were it not for the background noise of the tavern, the members of the Haunted Shadows would have heard a pin drop. None dared make a single move, not even crane their necks to check if Einhard still breathed. Raven slumped back into his seat, scraping a hand across his hairless head.
I'll send word for Cyrus,
he mumbled, retrieving another jug of mead that didn't belong to him from the table. Is that the same man as the Black Dog? Mason asked.
Aye,
their leader confirmed.
A wretchedly successful son of a bitch.
He inclined his head, about to continue, as he noticed a presence stop beside him. He turned in his seat, placing a hand on one of his hounds.
Oh, pretty boy,
he grinned in greeting. Not a single twitch graced Edric's expression, the youth refusing to speak. Instead, he pressed his thumbs against his shoulders, removing the straps of a large backpack. Hauling it forward, he let it slam down on the table, the distinct sound of metal clanging within. Raven's eyes bulged, flitting between the bag and Edric.
Is that what I think it is?
Not awaiting his reply, he immediately wrenched the top flap open, revealing the bejeweled contents. Coins, gems, necklaces, rings and goblets, gold and silver aplenty held within.
That bastard informant! He kept it all for himself.
Raven spun for Edric again, moving to pat him on the shoulder, but the youth stepped away.
Good job, pretty little Edric.
Raven picked up a silver coin, handing it to him.
Go, enjoy one of those fancy halls in the upper district.
A malicious smile snaked across his face, yet Edric would still not react. He merely accepted the payment, then walked away. Raven was satisfied. That was all that mattered. The stairs creaked as Edric ascended them, 2 steps at a time. The musty smell of the tavern lessened as he moved further away from the main hall, but there was no escaping it completely. Walking down a dimly lit corridor, only a couple of sconces still flickering along the walls, Edric stopped at the second to last door on the right. It was the room he shared with 2 of the other mercenaries. He entered, pushing the crooked door shut behind him, then crossed the small space. The furniture was sparse, including 2 simple cots and 1 unlit candelabra. The only light source was the single window through which the moon granted its inadequate shine. Stopping halfway, Edric frowned. Something was missing from his belongings, and it was not the first time. His bedroll was gone. He audibly sighed, but was too exhausted to care. Besides, dwelling on it would be of no use. Spiteful as they were, someone or another of the crew would always be out to taunt him. Placing his composite bow against the innermost wall, Edric unclipped the quiver strap, then threw it over his head. That, too, he placed erect onto the wall, then slumped down against the timbered wood. His eyes were nearly shutting on their own, the day having been long and draining. The floor was cold, a draught whistling up between the floorboards, but it couldn't be helped. With no strength left to complain, Edric merely curled up, using his arms for a pillow. Tomorrow was another day. Chapter 3. The Plaza. Despite growing up on a homestead, Mason had never cherished his life as a farmer. His father had, of course, wished for him to continue to work the land once he was gone, but Mason had never taken a fancy to the idea. Farming was not for him. Too much work for minimal reward, and absolutely no excitement. Worse yet was that every year risked being the last, purely due to factors over which he had no control. The droughts from the summer heat, or flash floods in the wet months of autumn. One bad season, and his whole livelihood could be gone, his family starved, and his life at an end. Mason had spent years since on the road, drifting from town to town, never settling down for good. The army, that was where Mason wanted to go. And his plan had seemed so simple at first, for who would turn down a healthy, strong, 22-year-old man? He had even attended Sunday tutoring at the local church of the goddess, so he was a savvy, educated man, considering his origin, or at least he would have thought so. But that had made no difference. King Kenneth Urchinwine, the ruler of all provinces within the Midlands, had put a stop to military recruitment due to the current state of peace in the country. The bastions, fortresses, and ramparts scattered across his lands were already brimming with able-bodied men, ready in case a disturbance arose. Any smaller skirmish was often resolved well before replenishment of recruits was ever needed. Mason had therefore been turned away again and again. It wasn't until he travelled to Western Ravenna, to the capital itself, that he had been blessed with a lucky strike. A slow decline into the lower district had resulted in increasing amounts of time spent in the gutter, along with prostitutes and criminals, some of whom were members of the Haunted Shadows. Raven had been recruiting at the time to strengthen his ranks after a few men had decided to leave the band. So here he was, part of a thieves' band. Seated alone at a table inside the Dirty Swan Tavern, he chuckled to himself. His situation wasn't funny, though, he decided. It was upsetting. He was an honourable young man, raised with values and virtues, not some lowly bandit. He was even a devout believer in the goddess of holy light, set on living a life free of sin, fighting in the name of righteousness. But having a moral code was for naught. Raven might have said they were an honest crew of mercenaries, but they all knew that was not true, and Mason had figured it out within the first night of meeting them. Yet now it was too late to do anything about his career choice. If he were to duck out now, he would be left without a copper to his name. He was dependent on Raven, and his leader knew that. Ever since Raven had started to hoggle their coin, he had them all maneuvered into staying, lest they wanted to return to the gutters. Mason supposed he could always approach the revered priesthood for employment. Only a few days' ride north of the capital, the clergy often recruited disciples to join their ranks, using their powers of the light to fight against demonkind. Lips flat, Mason pushed the thought aside. He recalled the many attacks Atua had suffered throughout his years living in the town. To even consider the battle against demons to be part of one's daily life. Mason shook his head. It baffled him that anyone would ever agree to keep such an occupation. Devout as he was, he would still rather sleep in the gutter any day of the week. Draining the last of his water, the liquid disconcertingly dark at the bottom of his pitcher, Mason looked about the main hall of the inn. Seated at another table, Edric was still present, also unaccompanied. The rest of the haunted shadows were either sitting around a group of tables at the other end of the room, or they had already left for the day. They all had their set assignments, procuring as many valuables as possible. Just because Edric had scored big the previous night didn't mean the rest could slack for even a moment. Rising, Mason left his pitcher on the table, then approached Edric with a friendly grin. "Good morning." Edric remained silent, stuffing the last of his food into his mouth. He chewed quickly, forcing it down with a gulp of water. Mason's smile turned apologetic. "I didn't mean to disturb you."
"Then go away,"
Edric hissed, coming to his feet. He grabbed a small backpack from the floor, slinging it over his shoulder. "Where are you heading to?" Mason inquired, trailing after the youth as he headed for the front door.
"Nowhere."
"Doesn't look like you're going nowhere," Mason argued. Edric stopped, turning to glare at him.
"Leave me alone,"
he ground out, then spun back around. Wrenching the door open, he left the inn, and Mason within it, behind. Edric was elusive at best, that was for sure. Mason had not been part of the Haunted Shadows long enough to really know anything about him, and the other band members weren't exactly a talkative bunch when it came to introductions. They would only ever open their mouths to brag to one another. A hot topic was women they had forced themselves upon, sometimes with the exchange of coins, but other times not. Another commonly discussed event was the amount of alcohol one man could ingest compared to another, or how much blood they had managed to draw in their latest battle, be it against a full-fledged warrior or a wayward goat. It made little difference. Leaving the Dirty Swan Tavern, Mason squinted against the onset of daylight. It was a chilly morning, the wetness on the streets rising into a mist with the rays of the rising sun. Further up the thoroughfare he could see Edric stalking away, his figure blurring into the fog. Mason took to following him, curious as to what he was up to. His own assignments could wait. It was a long walk through the capital, heading northeast through the winding streets. Soon the ground was covered in cobblestone, and the buildings became ever more massive, their exterior walls rendered with fine sand and lime. The upper district did have an entirely different atmosphere to that of the lower, no doubt. Watching Edric disappear around a corner, Mason picked up his pace, although he could guess where he was heading. The central Urchin Wine Plaza, the largest of all the squares in the city, which also hosted the most expansive market. Mason turned left behind the same building as Edric, emerging out onto the vast, circular space as expected. It was lined with shop fronts and merchant stalls, and the middle had a ring of several fully grown oak trees. In the very center stood one of the king's signature statues, one of bronze with the man himself standing victorious over an enemy, be it human or demon. But with the lack of conflicts, the image of a warrior king didn't quite seem truthful to Mason. Had he even been to war? Ever drawn his sword at an enemy? Mason shrugged the thought away, focusing on Edric, who now entered the crowd of people congesting the market space. Mason's eyes tracked him with intrigue, the youth's movements blessed with feline grace. He twisted and turned, barely feathering other people despite their closeness. Akin to a shadow, he shifted between them, not even glanced at in return. An expert in his craft, that's what he was. Mason could see Edric's nimble hand movements again and again, brushing past townsfolk. It wasn't noticeable to them, but Mason knew what he was doing, dislodging pouches, removing bracelets, and claiming anything of value as his own. An expert indeed. Mason only wondered for how long the boy had been doing this, and why the hell he had been taken on by a thieves' band like the Haunted Shadows at the age he was. Sleeves folded and shirt tucked into his leather trousers, it was the best way to present his shoddy apparel. Black fabrics were amongst the hardest to dye, thus yielding a high price when it came to clothing, but the colour was a requirement for all the members of the Haunted Shadows, as per instructions. Edric had owned his gear for a long time, so his recent growth spurt had meant most of his clothing had ended up too small. He had bought new trousers only in the weeks prior, albeit loose-fitting for him to further grow into, but he was yet to afford a shirt. Well, except if he was to use the silver coin Raven had given him the night before. It should cover the price for at least 2 pieces of black clothing and still leave room for change, Edric reckoned. But it was for naught, as he needed to acquire a new bedroll instead. He would purchase one in the lower district, where the prices were more agreeable. Or steal one. Whatever ended up simpler. Regardless, he had to save some of the coin, as he never knew when his next payday would come. One would think a man dressed entirely in black would stand out, but not so much in the upper district. Here, most people held plenty of coinage in their pouches, able to afford the richly dyed clothing, so Edric was certainly not alone in his choice of colour. It was only that frayed hem that gave it away, so he had resorted to hiding the sleeves and bottom of his shirt even before they became too short, or him too tall. The only item he could never wear was a hood or cowl, even at night. People used neither in the upper district, and they'd make him stand out like a blot on the landscape. He'd already tried that, and was nearly hanged for it. Stealing is simple enough, though, Edric thought, walking through the throng of people at Urchin Wine Plaza. A pouch here, a piece of jewellery there. He could probably snatch someone's beard off their chin if he so wanted. They wouldn't even notice. Never particularly blessed with a way of words, Edric relied on his wits instead, reading his surroundings with care and weighing his options accordingly. But he could only fit so much inside his own pouches. It was time to transfer some of his so-called daily earnings to his backpack. Slipping through the crowds of sellers and buyers, Edric headed for the oaks at the centre of the square. Around the trees stood several benches of wrought iron, and Edric aimed for the one most secluded, half veiled by a gnarled branch reaching lower than the rest of the greenery. The relocation of valuables had to be quick, as anyone fiddling about with coins and jewellery would fast become a target for prying eyes. Edric lowered his shoulder, allowing his backpack to slide down the length of his arm. "Halt, boy!" a voice ordered him from behind, its tone strengthened with utmost authority. Edric stiffened, his fingers wrapping around the shoulder strap of his backpack in a tight grip. He turned his head in the direction of the sound. A hulking man wearing metal armour, chainmail, metal pauldrons and high boots walked towards him. A tabard draped his chest and back, cinched at the waist by a wide belt. The fabric was emblazoned with the king's crest. Another royal knight.
Oh shit, not again.
What was it with these knights all of a sudden? They had barely ever bothered Edric, but now it was the second time in a couple of days that he had run into one.
What have you got in that backpack?
The knight questioned, moving forward as he reached for it. Edric slid back, his eyes narrowing.
None of your business.
The knight's eyebrows shot up.
Oh, it is now. So I suggest you heed my word, or you will be thrown in the dungeon for disobedience to authority. Don't you ever—
Edric's voice cut off at a sudden push to his side. He spun to find Mason standing beside him, the newly recruited member gifting him a broad smile. Edric stepped away from him, his expression hardening.
Who are you?
The knight demanded, glowering at the newcomer. I apologize, sir, Mason said, raising a hand and placing it on Edric's shoulder, yet the youth only retreated further. He sighed. But what business do you have with my brother? The knight slipped into silence for a moment, studying the two of them, one broad, with auburn hair and hazel eyes, the other slim, with blonde hair and blue eyes. Clearly unconvinced, the knight leaned forward.
I was about to inspect your brother's belongings, as I suspect him of theft.
He looked at Edric.
Now, hand over that bag. Do as he says,
Mason told Edric. Shooting daggers at him in return, Edric reluctantly obliged, holding his backpack forward for the knight to grab. It wasn't long before all the contents had been sifted through. A worn pair of leather gloves, where most of the fingertips were missing, a small whittling knife with a broken handle, and a tubular piece of black fabric suspiciously reminiscent of a mask.
My scarf,
Edric muttered.
It's getting colder.
Stuffing the items back in the bag, the knight returned it to its owner.
And your pouches?
Heat rushed to Edric's neck and face. Soon he would be visibly sweating. He swallowed, looking down at his belt. Then his breath caught. The pouch holding his haul of pickpocketed treasures was gone. His eyes darted along the ground, but he forced himself to remain still, afraid he might add to the knight's qualm.
Pouches,
the knight repeated, slowly this time.
Yeah, I heard you,
Edric shot back, loosening the threads to his two remaining pouches. He quickly handed them over, watching as the knight inspected the contents. A frown formed on the knight's forehead, and he reluctantly returned Edric's items to him.
I know you're up to something, so you'd better leave the plaza, or I will accompany you for the rest of the day.
Fine,
Edric huffed, glancing at Mason.
Good, and don't come back.
The knight turned on his heel and walked away, but looked across his shoulder more than once before disappearing into the nearby crowd. Edric spun for Mason.
What the hell do you think you're doing?
He snarled.
And brother of all things, how stupid do you think those knights are? I'm saving you from the dungeons,
Mason shrugged, reaching a hand behind his back.
No matter how mindless the rules.
Tucked into the waistline fabric of his trousers, Edric's missing pouch was safely kept. Mason loosened it, bringing it forward.
Here.
Edric snatched the pouch out of his hand.
Don't ever do that again. I don't want your help.
Want and need are not the same thing, Mason remarked, grinning. Balling his fists, Edric choked his reply and stormed away in a southern direction, back towards the lower district. Still in need of a bedroll, he headed for another marketplace. The day went quickly, thankfully enough. The weather held up despite the gathering clouds of the afternoon, and the temperature remained comfortable well into the night. Mason ambled across the lower district, careful to avoid any suspect piles or puddles along the way. Mason's previous life as a farmer's boy had not gone unnoticed by his, now, fellow thieves. One of his primary assignments had thus become to care for the Haunted Shadow's horses, in order to lower the cost of having them stabled during the band's stay at the capital. In essence, Mason had taken on working at the stables, shoveling horse dung and stacking hay bales for a few hours a day. But today he had turned up late and received a well-deserved earful about it. Unable to admit the reason for his delay, Mason had merely blamed it on the previous night being one of abundant drinks, yet he had still been in good spirits. For him, it was enough to know he had done a good deed by aiding Edric, even if the youth himself had seemed mighty unimpressed at the time. To make up for arriving late for his daily manure removal, Mason had taken it upon himself to exercise as many of the horses as he could, including those belonging to the stable owner himself. He had stayed long into the night, having taken them out one by one to stretch their long, unused legs. To Mason, it was a terrible notion to keep fine horses locked up in such a manner, not allowing them the freedom of movement the beautiful animals deserved. "A farmer's boy remains a farmer's boy," he mused, smiling to himself. No matter how boring a life it would have been, he obviously couldn't shake the habits or his love for animals. In the end, all the stalls were free of muck, and the horses were fed and watered. The stable owner had eventually calmed down and asked Mason to return the next day as usual. A turn left, then right, straight ahead and left again. He began to know the streets well. Finally arriving back at the Dirty Swan Tavern, Mason pulled the front door open and was immediately attacked by the now familiar wave of hot, humid, stale air. It was the same every night, but somehow, sitting there long enough, he would get used to it, most often within the hour. Yet something was decidedly different this night, even if the stifling whiff remained the same. Raven stood by their regular tables at the back, waving a fist at Ironhard. Not that his behaviour was in any way unusual, or that the two of them arguing was odd. It was Raven's words that were disconcerting.
You will do,
he hiccuped.
as I say.
Raven's slurred speech matched his uncoordinated movements as he pointed a shaky finger at Ironhard. Dusk and Shade barked their agreement, but remained at his side.
You can't be serious!
Ironhard raised his hands towards Raven, but threw furtive glances at the men around them. They all seemingly shrunk away, no one offering their support.
I'll spit it out for you,
Raven hissed, taking another swig from his jug of mead.
G-O-L-D. 1 demon.
He hiccuped again, his drink spilling onto the floor.
And we'll earn gold.
Forcing out a breath, Ironhard placed a hand on his face, the area still swollen from the night before.
We've decided to not engage demons. You've even said it yourself. The priesthood hunts demons, not us.
Raven suddenly stiffened, his diminished swaying making him appear slightly less intoxicated. He looked at his gathered band members, then back at Ironhard.
We've avoided demons,
he said, licking his lips,
until now.
Chapter 4. Open Heavens. Raven hadn't meant what he said, had he? Drunk as he was, the words couldn't possibly have held even the tiniest grain of truth. Mason drove a hand through his cropped hair, chipped fingernails digging into his scalp. He gawped at Raven and Ironhard, their argument reduced to a staring contest. If it weren't for the bustling ambience of the other drunkards inside the tavern, there would have been an uncomfortable silence spreading. A moment passed, then another. Looks were shared amongst the other men, yet not a single one of them dared speak up. Edric stood with his back against the innermost corner, even further away than the rest.
But a demon?
Ironhard finally repeated, his voice faltering. Raven took a bumbling step towards the man, his hounds faithfully flanking him with bared fangs.
You will listen, all of you!
He roared, disrupting the hum of conversation around them. Men and women from all directions threw glances at them, but even they knew better than to chime in. Mason remained at the door, but he didn't need to be any closer to hear.
We'll meet here at...
Raven hiccuped, then swore under his breath. With gritted teeth, he flailed a clenched fist at Einhard.
We'll meet here at sunrise.
He spun, swaying dangerously with the sudden motion. Grabbing onto the back of a chair, he straightened himself before moving towards the stairs, disappearing for the night. A less drunk, yet equally exasperated Raven met Mason and the others as they appeared the next morning. Raven glared at each of his mercenaries as they skulked past and seated themselves around the various tables. Mason moved to sit beside Edric, but the youth merely rose and walked away. Certainly not the easiest one to befriend, he thought. Raven regarded his men, his reddened eyes no less piercing despite the worn look on his face.
I won't tell you this again, so you'd all better pay attention. I was approached last night by a man claiming to offer a hefty amount of coin for killing and bringing back the body of a wolf demon.
Men shifted where they sat, sweaty palms dragged across trouser legs and hands scratching imaginary itches.
We're heading out today,
Raven went on,
and I won't have any of you question me about it.
But, Einhard protested, only to be cut short.
No!
Raven slammed his hand down on the table beside him, the men around it lurching back in their seats.
This is too good an opportunity to pass up, and we need the gold.
But what about little Edric's haul the other day?
One man questioned, receiving nods of agreement from some of the others.
Shouldn't that be enough for a while?
A shift in Raven's demeanour could be hinted, his eyes darting as he licked his lips.
Again, this is too good to pass up, and that's the end of this discussion.
He paused, his stance stiffening.
Our target's last known location is about an hour's ride from here, so we should be back by the end of the day.
Who's going with you?
Einhard asked, his mouth staying open as he awaited the selection to be called out.
You for starters,
Raven huffed, enjoying the man's whimper for a response.
As well as Gavin, Tiny, Sparks, Richard, and Leroy. Any more of us, and we'll only get in each other's way.
Mason searched the men for any reactions to their names. It was the best way to figure out who Raven was referring to, as the recruit was yet to learn what everyone was called. He found it surprisingly tricky to memorize all the names, but it was likely due to the mix of real names and nicknames. Mason wasn't even sure Raven was the leader's actual name. Probably not.
This'll be a hunt in the forest,
Raven continued.
So, the most skilled with a bow and arrow are coming.
Edric stepped forward, gaining the man's attention.
Why are you leaving me then?
Raven barked a laugh.
You may be the best at down in deer, pretty boy, but this will be no ordinary hunt.
He gave the youth a sly smile.
No children will be taken along.
Shuffling back, Edric slipped away again, not saying a word.
The rest of you, continue with your regular assignments. Anyone who doesn't will lose a finger tonight.
Edric swore, tearing his knife from its sheath. Child! He stabbed the blade into his bedroom wall, splinters flicking into the air. He was no longer a child, nor had he ever been allowed such luxury. But did Raven care? No, of course not. He had never cared and never would. The man would much rather cause problems than solve them. And causing them he had done plenty of throughout the years. Wrenching the weapon clear, Edric thrust it back into its protective cover. Why the sudden change of heart about fighting demons? Raven had always been steadfast, turning such requests down, so it was shocking that he had accepted this one, an abrupt reversal from one day to the next. Not even a discussion with the men had been held, or a mention that it might happen. This was not like him. Sure, Raven was greedy, but he wasn't dumb. Strapping the last pouch to his belt, Edric grabbed his backpack and left the meagre comforts of the bedroom, heading down the corridor. He descended the stairs, then crossed the main hall of the tavern. Observing those around him, he could see Mason still present, despite it almost being mid-morning. Edric sped up, unwilling to allow the man a chance to stop him. He hated recruits, because nearly all of them wanted to become acquainted with their new crewmates. But Edric wanted none of that. He didn't need them, nor did he wish to be around them. They could all rot in the deepest and darkest recesses of hell, for all he was concerned. Coming out onto the street, Edric took a different route this day. He refused to be followed, even though his destination was the same as before, Urchin Wine Plaza. Because regardless of whether this demon hunt paid the band well, Raven would expect no less of an effort on Edric's or anyone else's part. Dark clouds loomed above the Ovenna capital, droplets drizzling down on the streets and rooftops. Edric sounded out a breath, readjusting the shoulder strap of his backpack. The rain was such a nuisance, meaning fewer people would be out to populate the marketplace. Smaller crowds meant diminished cover, but also a reduction in possible profits. But then again, the sun would soon set earlier in the day, giving way to longer nights and increased opportunities for successful burglaries. Arriving at Urchin Wine Plaza, Edric wasted no time. He set to work, sliding in and out of the crowd, soon acquiring various coins and trinkets. By midday, almost 3 hours into his shifty work, he decided to retreat to the Dirty Swan Tavern. Emerging out onto an adjoining street, south of the square, he heard a shout behind him.
"Oi! I told you not to come back here!"
Edric immediately knew who it was, recognizing the voice. With a firm grip on the shoulder strap of his bag, he bolted off into a sprint. Heavy but quick footsteps thumped behind him, and he risked a glance. The damned knight was fast. But Edric was faster. Lean legs carried him like a sprightly fox as he dodged people, carriages, horses, boxes, and buildings. He sprinted for a wagon, clamping a hand on the top board, and vaulted across. Taking a sharp turn into a side street, he threw himself over a fence, then ran to the end of an alleyway. The rain around him increased into a violent downpour, the wetness whipping against Edric's face. He scaled a second wall and ran down another thoroughfare before finally allowing himself a look across his shoulder again. The knight was nowhere to be seen. But a few more detours wouldn't hurt. Edric couldn't risk bringing a royal knight into the midst of a thieves' band. Not that the knight would come out the victor, but it wouldn't be worth the exposure. The murder of one of the king's closest could stir a calamitous manhunt should news of it reach the royal court. Out of breath, sweat gleaming on his face, and rain hammering down around him, Edric cleared a locked 4-foot gate. Landing within the rear courtyard of a vast building, he quickly scrutinized the area. Piles of stacked lumber lined one side, the other hid behind open boxes of saws, hammers, and various other tools. Wood shavings covered the ground, turning into a soggy mess beneath Edric's feet. With a hand on his knife, he silently padded across the open courtyard, eyes darting through the wall of rain. He wasn't about to take any chances. Halfway to the other side, which held another gate, Edric heard a gnaw erupting behind him. His knife cleared its sheath within a second as he spun and took a wide stance. Yellowed teeth flashed, and a pair of dark eyes dug into him. The creature's ears were pulled back, head held low. It was a massive sable dog, almost the same size as Raven's two vicious companions, and it was clearly not happy about Edric's trespassing. Licking his lips, Edric searched the courtyard for anything he might be able to use as a distraction for the animal, but there was nothing. And was he to turn and run, the dog would be attached to his leg before he even managed to reach the far gate. How he wished he had brought his bow at this very moment. Another growl rolled out from the dog, and it took a defiant step forward. Edric stood back, straightening his thin frame as he returned the knife to his belt. Lowering himself onto his haunches, he half-turned, facing away from the animal. He was in luck, the rain letting up for a moment, subsiding into a light drizzle. The rumbling faded away as the dog cocked its head. "It's all right," Edric whispered, daring a glance. With its tail dropping and ears flicking forward, the dog slowly made its way over to Edric. The nose bobbed as it sniffed his hair. "There's a good cow," Edric praised, although he wasn't sure of its gender. "You're not like Raven's terrors, are you?" Seemingly satisfied Edric wasn't a threat, the dog slobbered its tongue up his face, the tail wagging, then turned to amble back from whence it came. Edric rose, watching as it disappeared between the stacks of wood, crates, and barrels. Moving for the rear gate, he climbed across it. He clearly needed to start bringing his set of lockpicks even on pickpocketing outings. Resuming his deviating path around the lower district, Edric began to wonder what the hell he was doing. Not just this day, but with his life as a whole. Why would his existence never change? Had the goddess indeed brought him on this path? When they had parted, his mother's last words had been to place trust in her greatness, but could he? No, the goddess couldn't possibly be the only one to affect a person's living or journey through life. Ultimately, it was up to each and every one, their fate formed by their decisions and actions. So why was Edric lingering? The haunted shadows had not once treated him fairly, yet he stayed without fail. He longed to leave them behind, to find his own way through life, but he couldn't, not until he knew, once and for all. What had happened to his mother? Sweat beaded on Raven's head, but it was obscured by the thousands of droplets beating down on him from above. An arrow hissed overhead, finding its target in the massive wolf before him. Yellow eyes stared at Raven, fangs bared and claws sinking into the ground. The grey coat was darkened under the downpour, the colour muddled and smeared red with blood. The spreading demonic mist from the wolf, black fog rolling over the forest floor, diminished with each passing second. Any fear the men had felt as they initially charged was all but gone. And not a second too soon, for they had teetered on the brink of flight. Re-gripping the hilt of his sword, Raven sprinted forward again, backed by Einhard and Gavin. They barreled towards the wolf from all directions, their blades connecting with flesh and bone. A screeching howl rippled from the demon, and it snapped at Raven. Sending his weapon in a wide arc, Raven slashed across its snout, sidestepping out of its deadly path. He stabbed at the beast in pursuit, driving the steel deep into its flank. A spray of crimson suddenly erupted from its throat, the glint of metal protruding through the fur. Einhard tore his weapon clear, then hefted it for another swing. A final thrust saw the demon dead, the massive wolf crashing down against the undergrowth. Shoulders rolling and chest heaving, Raven looked at each of his men. They were blood-stained and worn, but they were all alive. They had completed their mission, their payment awaiting them as they returned to the capital. Mason could hear the rain intensifying atop the stable roof. The gentle tapping churned into a relentless thunder, water splashing onto the floor beside the open double doors of the north entrance. The horses stood silently in their individual stalls and boxes, although they were fewer in number since Raven's departure with his select men. Watered and fed, the animals seemed oblivious to the raging storm building beyond the stable walls. It was the worst part about late summer and the inevitable encroachment of autumn, the heavy rain. Recalling the number of times Mason had been forced to dig drainage ditches around fields, slogging away in the cold mud, made him shudder. His life back in Atua had inarguably been no better. Heaving the last hay bale up against the wall, Mason stood back. He had stacked them nicely to be kept dry and close at hand for feeding the horses. It was the last of his assignments for the day, so he was free to go. Moving for the door, he found his thoughts quickly wandering. Sure, it had not been better in Atua, but how much difference had his venture out into the world really made? His present situation meant he had traded cows for horses, fields for muck, and forest roads for streets. He had certainly not gone from boring to exciting, as he had hoped. Stuck in the same old ways, he was desperate to shed the traces of his previous life once and for all. But how? By hunting demons? Another tremor shook Mason's body as he peered out the stable doors. He could barely see the nearby buildings due to the open heavens, as if the source of a waterfall sat above the doorway. Demons had never been part of Mason's plan, but if Raven insisted on it becoming their new game and a regular part of their lives, then perhaps the priesthood might not be such a bad option. At least they had some fancy magical powers to use against the creatures of darkness, and not just swords and arrows, or so the stories were told. Sucking in a breath, Mason shot out of the stable building. The packed dirt on the street was fast turning into sludge, and Mason slipped and stumbled, but he managed to right himself before planting his face in the mud. Keeping up his speed, it wasn't long until he arrived outside the Dirty Swan Tavern, yet his clothing was no less drenched. A warm fire and a good meal sounded like a pleasant outlook for the remainder of this day, as he and many of the other members of the Haunted Shadows awaited Raven's return. Boots thumped across creaking floors, a young girl adding logs to a dwindling fire. Another of the innkeeper's children, a boy no more than the age of 6, swept away dirt and gravel with a broom holding fewer bristles than the number of hairs on Raven's head. He might as well have scraped the floor with a shovel. It would have been just as inefficient. Edric snorted, finding it ridiculous that children were left to do such chores. They were up late at night, attending to drunkards and cleaning away their filth, only because their parents were too busy serving their customers half-burnt food and low-grade drink. Sitting below the stairs, shaded from the flickers of candelabras and sconces, Edric only observed. Were it not for his room being so cold at night, he would have already settled into his new, lawfully acquired bedroll, if only to get away from everything. But at least here, seated apart from everyone, he was left undisturbed. A sudden bang had Edric look up, and the front door stood ajar, the wind howling beyond the dark opening. Raven stepped across the threshold, a wicked grin contorting his features. He seemed much too satisfied with himself, patting each of his dogs on the shoulder. "Their outing must have been a success," Edric concluded. He silently rose, moving closer. Trailed by his chosen group of 6, Raven walked up to the rest of his men, holding a closed fist above one of the tables. His fingers uncurled, and 4 massive canine teeth dropped onto the wood. "Success!" he proclaimed, Reaching for his belt, he unclipped a bulging pouch, and that too he slammed down on the table.
"Drinks are on me!"
The members of the Haunted Shadows roared with elation, fists pumping into the air. It wasn't long before every one of them staggered across the main hall of the tavern, slurring their words or creating yet another mess for the poor innkeeper's son to clear up. So drunk were they that they never noticed Raven's absence, except for one of them. This time, Edric had acquired a cloak on his way out of the tavern. Granted, it was not his own, but that was not exactly a cause for concern. Raven's demeanour, however, was. Not at all as drunk as the rest of his crew, Raven strode along the wet streets of the lower district, clearly with a goal in mind. Where was he going? Edric stayed at a safe distance, avoiding the few lanterns and torches that had miraculously survived throughout the heavy rain. He needed to be mindful of Raven's dogs as well, and the direction of the wind to avoid them picking up his scent. Stalking Raven was more straightforward than expected, yet Edric would never risk being seen. Not by Raven or anyone else. He'll kill me, Edric reasoned, although the thought in itself was surprisingly tempting. At this point, any way out of this life was an attractive prospect. So why did he care what Raven was up to? It was a mystery in itself. With Raven rounding another building and dusk and shade padding behind him, Edric was careful not to mindlessly follow. The route led into a slim alleyway, which could very well hold the spot for a scheduled meeting. Peeking around the corner, Edric found his suspicions confirmed. Raven was talking to another man, but Edric was too far away to listen in on the conversation. A fiery exchange was made. The dogs growled, Raven silencing them with a slap to their heads. He shouted profanities at the stranger and the dogs alike, his arms arching through the air with fists clenched. He cursed, slamming something down onto the other man's open palm. The glint of metal could be seen, trickling down onto the ground. Was Raven giving him coinage? If so, for what? What was going on? Raven turned away, heading back the same way he had come, shade close on his heels. Dusk remained for a moment longer, snarling at the stranger.
"Dusk!"
Raven rumbled, the dog immediately setting after him. Edric retreated, sprinting up the street and out of sight. Chapter 5. A Sharpened Blade. Colder weather crept in with the encroaching autumn, nature shifting vibrant shades of green for burgundy and ochre. Not that Edric saw much of the change, stuck as he was inside the defensive curtain walls of the capital. Ignoring Mason and his attempts at starting conversations from the opposite side of the stables, Edric ran the brush down his mare's flank. The bay coat shone under his care, the old horse snorting, flicking her tail. She had always been a welcome distraction, taking the darkest edge away from the severity of life. She was smaller, with a sloped back, but friendly enough, and held plenty of stamina. Edric had tended to her for years now, ever since she had been brought along with the haul from an estate raid in Rover. Edric kept grooming her, lost in thought. Over a month had passed since the Haunted Shadows had killed their first demon. More had fallen since, both foxes and rodents chased off from a neighbouring village. Well, chased off and slain, that was, because killing demons warranted a higher payout, which Raven sought at every turn, much more so than before. Raven had always carried a bad habit of drinking, with subsequent abuse of any form to follow in his wake, but something was different this time. Edric only wondered what. He had trailed him at night, seen how he frequented other taverns, some shadier than others, but Edric was yet to find the source of this shift in behaviour. It couldn't only be due to the exchange of coin that often took place afterwards. There was more to this. Satisfied with the mare's coat being clean, Edric returned the brush to a crate outside the horse's box, then hurried past Mason. He wasn't in the mood for small talk. More rain fell beyond the stable doors. Edric shot out and around the corner, stopping beneath the protruding overhang of the building, one of the only dry spots available. He blew some hair from his face, sinking to the ground. Free of showers and away from the various stable hands, this was a place as good as any. Pushing a hand into a pouch, Edric brought forth a small piece of polished metal. He turned and tilted it, regarding the reflection of his face on its surface. The older he got, the more pronounced his high cheekbones became and his jawline more defined, features that were considered handsome. Edric loathed them. Pretty boy. That's what they had always called him. Or pretty little Edric, whenever the mercenaries were in the mood. And how he hated those names. At the mere thought of them, he felt as if his belly was wrenched by an invisible grip. Bringing his knife out, Edric held it to his cheek. Just a cut, here and there, and perhaps all those so-called attractive features would be carved away forever. He had always considered the notion but never had the nerve to do it. Whatever stopped him he wasn't sure, but he couldn't muster the courage. Not this time either. Instead, he propped the makeshift mirror up before him, then held his knife aloft. The blade bit into his hair, slicing away at the blonde strands. One section at a time fell to the ground, and his tangled mop was soon several inches shorter, free of any uncomfortable mats. Edric ran a thumb down to his chin. More and more stubble was appearing by the day. Facial hair was a relatively new nuisance in his life, but no less irking. If only he knew how best to remove it. Mason patted his hands over his thighs, sending horsehair and powdery dirt whirling into the air. No matter the amount of rain, the inside of the stables was still dry and dusty. Luckily enough, he thought, since it kept the hay, the horse's primary source of food, in superb condition. Any wet to creep in amongst the bales might cause mould and other nasty pests to take hold, and Mason certainly did not want that. Finished for the day, he left the stable buildings, about to walk to the nearby street, as he recognized a figure seated against the exterior wall. Holding a knife to his neck, the familiar youngster would have looked mighty madcap, was it not for a piece of metal he held in his other hand. Changing his course, Mason approached him. "What are you up to?" he chirped, noting the locks scattered around Edric, and his now much shorter haircut. "What does it look like I'm doing?" Edric shot back without so much as glancing at him. "Shaving poorly, but I thought I'd give you a chance to admit it." Gritting his teeth, Edric scowled at him. "Well, don't just stand there. Show me how to do it, then." Mason felt like asking for a please to follow that request, but he opted not to. He knelt down beside Edric instead, inspecting his blade. "First, make sure your knife's sharp." Edric's glare intensified. "Right, of course, it is." Mason's eyes flicked sideways for a moment. "The other important thing is that you don't allow your beard to grow too long." Seeing Edric's mouth open, he raised a hand to silence him. "I know yours isn't that bad. I'm only saying." Mason retrieved a knife from his belt, running a quick finger across the blade end. He placed a hand to his own face, his thumb and index finger stretching the skin on his cheek. "Pull the skin taut and shave along with the grain," he went on, demonstrating the move on himself. Tiny specks of stubble fell from his face like dust. "Don't apply pressure. You'll only cut yourself. Let the knife do the work." Edric nodded, copying his technique. Working in silence, he was soon able to enjoy a clean-shaven jaw and chin, not a single nick in sight. Mason rose, returning his blade to its sheath. "Are you heading back to the inn?" He could discern a slight bob to Edric's head. "Let's walk together then," Mason decided, heading towards the street. He only hoped Edric would agree. Footsteps sounded behind him as the youth caught up. "I meant to ask you," Mason went on, without looking at him. "Have you ever considered joining the priesthood?" "No," came the answer, swift and resolute. "How come? The haunted shadows are already fighting demons." Edric kicked a pebble on the ground, the stones skittering across the dirt road. "I follow Raven." Mason shrugged. "Ain't no different from following a priest, though the priest probably swears less." A snort sounded, but Mason wasn't sure if it was because Edric found it funny or offensive. "Or do you not believe in the goddess?" Edric halted, and Mason only made it another couple of steps before facing him. "Well?" Mason asked again. "I'm not leaving, and certainly not for some damned goddess who doesn't pay heed to her subjects." "Doesn't pay heed to them? The goddess—" "Be quiet!" Edric snapped, striding past Mason. "I won't be justifying my choices to you or anyone else. And I'm a criminal. My life is forfeit. It'd be useless trying to join the priesthood, so just shut up already." Mason tailed him. "I'm not about to attempt to convince you. I'm only saying it because I'm considering it myself." "Then sod off! I don't care!" Mason grinned unperturbed. "I'll tell you if I'm about to leave." Edric muttered something inaudible, picking up speed, but Mason kept a pace. "You might think the priesthood shuns lawbreakers, but I've asked around, and it's not true." Spinning on his heel, Edric faced him, spitting out, "Believe what you will, I don't care. Just leave me alone." Edric cursed, uttering profanities as he turned onto the street leading to the dirty Swan Tavern. The day was slowly transitioning into evening, the setting sun painting the sky in scarlet and pink. Mason was silently walking behind him, clearly no longer interested in keeping the argument going, and thankfully so. Entering the inn, and met by two familiar and raging voices, Edric had the instant urge to turn in the doorway and walk back out, yet he knew better. He stopped, merely sidestepping to allow Mason passage. Raven balled a fist, hammering it into Einhard's face, sending the man crashing to the floor, not unlike a felled oak.
"Why I need more damn coins has nothing to do with you,"
Raven shouted, swaying violently, but at least he didn't slur this time. He eyed each of the men present.
"In case you forgot, I am the leader of this pathetic crew of low-life scum, and we will accept this new demon hunt. Don't you dare question my authority, any of you!"
Raven hawked and spat a glob of mead-infused phlegm onto Einhard, then moved for the door, his two dogs tailing him. A shiver trickled down Edric's back, and Raven stared at him as he walked past, but said nothing. Mouth agape, Mason blinked. "What is going on?" Clenching his jaw, Edric turned for the door. "Nothing to do with you! Leave it!" 2 quick steps, and Edric had ambled back out onto the street, following Raven's trail. Raven staggered, his hand shooting out in search of support by the nearby wall. His hounds darted around him, avoiding his erratic stomping. He had walked, or more often stumbled, all the way across the lower district, closing in on the same place where Edric had committed his latest murder. Ahead, Raven scratched his hairless scalp, then let his hand fall to his waistline. He dug into a pouch, bringing out a few coins. He seemed to count them, dropped 2, wobbling as he retrieved them, then lost his grip on another 3. Edric looked around, wary of any strangers who might take advantage of Raven's state of intoxication. For no matter how well he could fight, he would be hard-pressed to win when smashed out of his head. Gritting his teeth, Edric scolded himself. Why did he even care? His leader had never treated him well, yet Raven was all he had. Returning the coins to his pouch, Raven moved on. He braced himself against the wall again, attempting to remain on his feet. A few turns and alleyways later, Raven seemed satisfied with his destination. He casually leaned against a small, rickety shed, nodding greetings to another man approaching him. The stranger wore a brown cloak with the hood pulled halfway down his face. Edric hid behind a wagon, watching from a distance, not unlike that first time he had followed Raven. He couldn't recognize the other man, but this time coins were exchanged in the opposite direction, and Raven dismissed the stranger. As swiftly as ever, Edric stepped away from the wagon, crouching down to stay out of sight. Raven backtracked his staggering steps, hounds padding beside him. Edric initially thought he would return to the tavern where they lived, but he soon noticed the leader deviating from the path. Raven moved down a narrow thoroughfare, crossed another street, then stopped at a tall, wrought iron gate. He stood up straight, appearing sober in but a moment. A shadow drifted beyond the entranceway, and Raven seemed to address whoever it was, after which he was allowed entry. The gate rattled and creaked, shutting with a bang behind him. Edric surveyed the building. 2 floors, glass windows, a shingled roof, plastered exterior walls. The establishment was clearly private, and the owner was undoubtedly wealthy. But why would someone with this amount of money reside in the lower district? He needed a view into the building to see what was going on. Approaching the wall, Edric searched for anything to climb on, but he found nothing. The wall was much too smooth, and the windows too far apart. There were no ladders along the street, nor any other means to scale the house. If only he managed to gain a view through one of the windows, the outside darkness would help meld him with his surroundings, giving him the opportunity he needed. Turning to head back towards the entrance, Edric, startled, faced by an unfamiliar man. Within but a moment, blackness encompassed him. Chapter 6. Repeat. Edric couldn't see a damn thing, the sack over his head as black as death itself. His hands bound with a length of rope, he was being shoved and pulled along by his captor. The man walked beside him, steering Edric towards whatever destination he had in mind. Their proximity to one another caused a wave of building nausea in Edric, yet his mouth felt strangely dry, his head throbbing. He needed to focus, regain control, and will the sensations away. But it was a lost cause. Sweat erupted, forming rivulets down his back, and his heart began to thump in his chest. Was his captor part of the establishment? Perhaps a random thug, or even that royal knight from Urchin Wine Plaza? Screeching reverberated before Edric, his head jerking back despite his lack of sight. The noise was the very same as when Raven had entered the front gates. To bring me inside, someone must have spotted me, Edric thought. His situation wasn't wholly bleak, he mused, since he would most likely find out what took place within the grand home. It was only a question of what punishment awaited him at the end. Edric caught his foot on 3 thresholds, skimming several more, the echo from his shuffling boots shifting in tone each time. He assumed it mirrored the size of his surroundings. Finally, Edric felt himself being halted, fingers clamped to his arm, and a latch clicked and groaned ahead of him. A dank and musty smell attacked Edric's nose through the dark fabric. He recoiled, but the hand directing him held firm. "Move," the unknown man ordered. Edric felt the floor for another threshold, careful to avoid stumbling over it, then took another step. He unexpectedly dropped several inches, whipping his bound hands up to counteract his swaying. "Stairs," his captor supplied. "Now move." Edric tensed, alarmed at this, but decided to follow the man's command. Reaching the bottom of the stairs, he could hear the ever-increasing din of cheers mixed with swearing, grunts and hollering. A menacing growl rumbled, accompanied by barking. Dogs, but they didn't quite sound like ravens. Fingers gripped the hood over Edric's head, and strands of his hair were sent flying as it was ripped away, expecting to be faced by the very lowest dregs of society. He blanched at the sight of countless men dressed in high-end, tailored clothing. The spacious hall Edric found himself in was dimly lit by ornate silver candelabras, the stone walls adorned with matching sconces. There were no windows, nor any other entrance, save for the one he had come through. Tables were spread about the vast space, with plenty of the men seated along either side of them, dice and coin pinging across the wooden surfaces. Yet most of the rich and noble stood gathered around what seemed to be a sudden drop in the floor, the same place from which the snarls and barks resounded. Edric strained to swallow, being guided in the direction of the hole. Even if he had never laid eyes upon the place, he had heard of it. He knew what this was. The tomb. "Your boy slave," Edric's captor said as he brought him to the only man the youth recognized. Flanked by his hounds, Raven turned, his eyes disturbingly dark, set on Edric. "Oh, have you brought a boy for the tomb?" inquired a stranger, his head adorned with a brown mop of hair and his eyes a light blue. He angled for Raven, regarding Edric up and down as he frowned. "I must admit, I am uncertain how long he would survive." Raven's arm flashed out, grabbing a tight hold on Edric's chin. He pulled him in, his expression hardening.
"If he weren't such a spindly little shit, I'd pit him against one of those dogs."
He jerked a thumb towards the hole in the floor, just as blood fountained over the edge. A distressed yelp rippled out, then a thump. The men standing by the edge roared. One of the dogs was likely dead. Gambling, betting, wagering. Was that what Raven was doing? "Then are you to sell him?" asked the blue-eyed nobleman. "Because I am afraid he currently does not seem to be of the best age to yield the highest price. Much too tall for a child, and too thin for a fighter."
"I ain't selling him,"
Raven snapped at the man. "Then what is he doing here, if not to offset your debt? Those measly coins you brought earlier aren't enough." A shudder shook Edric's body, but he steeled himself, staring at Raven. "Sir, are you gambling all the coin away?" Raven released a laugh, leaning forward.
"It's my coin. I do with it as I will."
The alcohol-laced breath stung Edric's eyes. He gulped down a whimper, unable to remove himself from Raven's grip. "Depends who you ask," the nobleman butted in. "I would wager it is more my coin than yours. May I remind you we will be sending the knights your way tomorrow unless you pay up." Like that of a vicious bear demon, Raven's head snapped sideways, baring teeth towards the nobleman.
"I know."
The nobleman merely waved him off. "Then I suggest you acquire the funds you need." Spinning around, he disappeared into the crowd. Raven immediately yanked Edric closer.
"Don't think I've not noticed, pretty boy,"
he whispered, wetting his lips.
"You've been mighty nosy lately, haven't ya?"
Edric shook his head, attempting to pull back, but both Raven and his initial captor held firm. Sweat dripped from Edric's hair, running down his neck, his mouth cracked open.
"Haven't you learnt a damned thing throughout the years? I thought you knew to stay away, but instead you come here, humiliated me in front of all these men."
Raven's other hand lashed out, clutching Edric's hair and pushing his head down. A vicious tug saw them moving for the lone exit, blonde strands raining down before Edric's face. Dusk and Shade yapped and snarled with excitement, faithfully shadowing their owner. Dragged up the stairs, Edric fumbled, flailing his bound hands in front of him. He felt his heart racing, his toes going numb. The bile in his throat was ready to erupt, and his breaths came in short and fast.
"To think it's been over 10 years,"
Raven reminisced, casually, as if about to tell a bedtime story.
"and still you've not learnt. If you weren't so successful on the streets, I'd wager you were dim-witted. More so than Ironhard."
Hauled through one corridor after the next, then several reception rooms, Edric desperately fought to stay on his feet. He wheezed, struggling to draw a full breath.
"No need for panic now,"
Raven told him, wrenching his head up for their eyes to meet.
"I'm only going to beat you to an inch of your pathetic life. Pretty little Edric."
No stars were visible through the ominous clouds hanging from the sky. The sun had set, and the crescent moons obscured, neither offering much light across the capital as Edric tumbled headlong into the street. He landed awkwardly, twisting an ankle, the heels of his hands scraping across the dirt road. Raven turned behind him as though nothing had happened, said his goodbyes to the gatekeeper, then bent down to hasten Edric's rising. Edric's spine cracked as he was bent backwards. He thrashed in Raven's grip, managing to find his footing.
"Stop struggling, or I'll beat you here and leave you to die in the sardine gutter,"
Raven hissed in Edric's ear, tugging at him yet again to usher him on.
"Now, get going."
A muffled cry slipped from Edric's lips, and Raven's grip on his arm tightened without delay. Despite his best attempts to remain calm, Edric felt his breath hitch, tremors forking out within his body unrestrained. As they barreled through the lower district, Edric's boot came off his foot. Raven only punted it aside, shoving the youth forward. Anyone they met stopped and stared, mouths agape at the stampeding duo, yet Raven positively ignored them. Instead, he pushed harder, increasing their pace along the streets of the lower district. Edric whimpered ahead of him, biting his lip in an attempt to stifle the sound. Arriving at the temporary accommodations of the haunted shadows, Raven thrust Edric through the front door of the inn, sending him crashing to the floor of the main hall. A man jumped at the youth's sudden appearance, dropping a jug of mead onto his table, its contents spilling out. Others gulped, dumbstruck to silence. Edric coughed, rolling to his side to regain his bearings. Only a second passed before he saw a boot arching across the wooden floorboards, finding its target in his soft belly. With the air knocked out of him, he curled up, wrapping his roped arms against his chest. Yet to draw a full breath, he felt a sudden pressure to his hip, the weight of that same leather footwear pressing down on him.
"All of you bleeding dimwits had better listen up,"
Raven roared, the music at the back of the room instantly ceasing, and anyone speaking halting mid-sentence. Raven stared at his men, all seated around the nearby tables.
"This is the last time I'll tell you. Do not question my goddess-damned authority. My word is law in this crew, and whoever doesn't like it,"
he twisted his arm around, pointing at the door,
"go ahead and bloody leave."
Not one man moved a finger or said a single word. A vicious grin spread across Raven's cheeks.
"Pretty boy here thought he'd give it a go."
Using his foot, he pushed Edric onto his back.
"Stalked me, he did, and I'll make him regret being such a nosy son of a bitch."
His boots swung wide, savagely thumping against the youth's side. A groan burst from Edric's throat as he brought his bound hands down, desperate to defend himself against the abuse, but it made no difference. Raven kicked at him again and again.
"Embarrassing me in front of potential employers,"
he shouted, then aimed a string of saliva at Edric's face. Half was left hanging from his chin, and the man cleaned it away with his sleeve before grabbing a nearby stool. Holding two of the crudely fashioned pin legs in a tight grip, he heaved it over his head. The nearby innkeeper gasped, drawing his son and daughter in and turning them away from the ongoing abuse. The stool crashed down over Edric, snapping ribs as if they were but twigs. He howled in agony, wriggling like a worm on a fisherman's hook. Twisting and contorting, he turned back onto his side, his belly roiling. He could no longer hold back, his stomach contents splattering over the floor. Visitors of the tavern slipped past and bolted out the door, table after table quickly emptying. The innkeeper ushered his children away, and the musician moved for the rear entrance. Only 2 tables away from Raven and Edric, Mason shifted in his seat. Clamping a hand to his chair, he motioned to rise, but the man next to him held him back. "Don't," Gavin whispered. "You'll only make it worse." "But he needs help," Mason stressed, his eyes flitting between Edric and Gavin. Raven bent down, clutching Edric's shirt and sending hit after hit into his face. One of his eyes immediately blackened and swelled, blood spilling from a cut above the brow and another below his chin. "You can't," Gavin hissed. "Unless you want to be on the receiving end of his abuse, there's nothing you can do. It's not for us to get involved, not even if you want to join in. Edric is off limits." Standing up straight, Raven rolled his shoulders back. He watched as Edric strained to get up on all fours, his tied hands only allowing him a shambling crawl as he attempted to get away.
"Where do you think you're going, pretty boy?"
Lifting his foot, Raven allowed his heavy boot to slam down straight over Edric's back. Edric thudded to the floor, unleashing a gut-wrenching scream, and Raven stomped on his hands with a sickening crunch.
"Had enough yet?"
Raven taunted, kicking Edric in the face again.
"Maybe I'll just wipe that bonny little face off ya."
With his surroundings all but a blur, Edric could no longer tell what was going on. Everything spun viciously, colours flashing before his eyes. Then darkness edged his vision. He was done. Spent, if not at death's door. There was not an inch of his body which did not scream for release, to be allowed reprieve in this moment of torture. And yet relief eased his suffering. It had only been a beating, something which he would take any day above Raven's other punishments. Indeed, he would even count his blessings. Edric convulsed, only able to release a shuddering whine, blood and vomit gushing from his mouth. Another dull thump shook his body, but he could barely feel the abuse now. Raven continued to kick, yet Edric merely shut his eyes. There was no resistance left in him, his mind drifting away from the horrors of his reality as he allowed darkness to claim him. Thrusting his boot into Edric's still body a final time, Raven stood back, wiping sweat from his bald head. Winded, but no less grinning, he came to his full height, his dark eyes searching each of his men. He stretched his fingers, his knuckles throbbing and raw in triumph. Raven determinedly headed for one of the tables, sending the man closest to it shrinking into his seat, just like a cowering dog before an enraged master. Retrieving a half-drained mead pitcher, Raven finished the remainder of the drink in but a few gulps. He slammed the mug back down, then glared at Mason. Perspiration broke out across Mason's forehead, and he didn't dare to so much as breathe.
"Oi, farm boy,"
Raven sneered at him.
"See to this useless pile of dung on the floor here. Make sure he survives or I'll have your head on a platter. As for the rest of you—"
He beheld his men, all of them slumped, pale and sweating.
"Follow me."
The members of the Haunted Shadows shared tentative glances, only a couple of them rising.
"We will leave tonight,"
Raven commanded, heavy breaths tearing through his chest.
"We've got a demon to kill."
Edric lay limp in Mason's arms, all skin and bones under the layers of dark fabric. He might have been tall, but he looked akin to a starved foal, lanky and disproportionate. Mason had long since known he was thin, but never that his condition was this serious. Ascending the stairs, Mason made a cursory check of Edric, who remained draped over his arms. He lacked a boot, and his shirt was torn in several places, but Mason couldn't tell much more than that. He would need to examine him closer, away from everyone. Raven was organizing his men, shouting orders and throwing further abuse, albeit verbal, for now. Knowing they were about to face another demon of all things, Mason was happy to take on caring for Edric instead. Looking down at him, Mason stopped for a moment, listening, assessing his breathing. It was ragged, gurgling and hitching. He prayed Edric had not punctured a lung, for he had most likely broken and bruised more than just one rib from Raven's unrelenting assault. Carrying him, slow and gentle, Mason walked down the hall of the second floor, using his foot to push open his bedroom door. He normally shared it with 3 other men, but they would be gone for the night. Lowering Edric to a cot, Mason propped his head up on a pillow, then knelt beside him. With a hand to the youth's chest, he gently shook him, but Edric remained unconscious. Then again, Mason was not surprised, considering Edric's face was barely recognizable, the swelling so pronounced. To be beaten black and blue had reached a new level of meaning for the recruit, never having witnessed a worse thrashing. Mason delicately clutched Edric's hands, untying the knots binding his wrists together. Slowly he managed to unwrap the rope, tossing it to one side, then examined Edric's fingers. Nothing seemed to be broken, none of the digits protruding at any disconcerting angle, but they all looked angry and purple. The skin also held plenty of scrapes and splinters from the downstairs floor, while nasty rope burns circled his wrists. A swift peek underneath Edric's shirt, and Mason's face contorted. Discolouring, scrapes, and cuts were abounding. Rising, Mason left the room, heading back downstairs to retrieve clean water and any towels he might be allowed by the innkeeper. "For the lad?" the owner asked from his place behind the counter. His eyes shifted towards the puddle of blood and chunder only a few feet from the door. Mason dipped his chin. I've been left to care for him." The innkeeper wrung his hands. "We want no trouble. We'll supply you with what you need, then leave us be." He disappeared into a room behind the bar, soon returning with the requested items. A bucket filled with fresh water sloshed over the countertop as the innkeeper handed it to Mason. Then he piled up several cotton towels. Is he alive, then?" Mason's jaw tightened. "For the moment." The innkeeper nodded soberly. "I'll pray for him. The goddess heals." Scratching his head, Mason smiled bleakly. "Maybe, but thank you for your help." Gathering the towels, he returned to his room, entering as silently as he could. Despite his best efforts, the door still groaned, announcing his arrival much too freely. Edric shifted on the bed, his head lifting. Sucking in a breath, Mason hurried over. He placed the bucket on the floor, throwing the towels onto the bed. "Edric, can you hear me?" Only able to open one of his eyes, Edric was forced to crane his neck in order to see who spoke. "Mace!" He suddenly gagged, bringing a blackened hand to his mouth. Quickly retrieving the chamber pot below the bed, Mason barely managed to catch the first splash of vomit. "Concussion. That's what the doctor said when it happened to me," he related, helping Edric to lie on his side. Another hurl and more bile built up in the pot. "You took plenty of hit to the head." Edric didn't have the chance to reply, another wave of nausea washing over him. He spewed into the chamber pot again and again until his body shook with agony as there was nothing left to heave. "I know, because I once had a log felled on me. Thought I'd cracked my head open with all the blood, but it was only the skin that split." Edric glared at him with his good eye, but said nothing. He merely slumped onto his back with a grunt, clamping his hand against his chest. You probably have cracked ribs, Mason provided, noticing his discomfort. But it looks like you'll live. A bitter laugh escaped Edric.
Fantastic.
He twisted with a snarl, a blind hand flailing for the chamber pot, another round of gagging racking through his body. Mason immediately supplied the bowl, catching what little was left to be disgorged from Edric's stomach. It'll be a long night, but don't you worry. I'll watch over you.
I don't need you,
Edric wheezed, flopping back on the bed. Sure, but I'll stay here nonetheless. Edric snorted, but his expression soured with the pain it caused. Leaning in, Mason lowered his voice. Have you given any more consideration to leaving? Edric strangled a cough, attempting to avoid the added discomfort it would cause.
I can't.
Why not?
I just can't. Leave it.
But to go elsewhere, leave this world behind. Is that not something you'd want? Freedom?
Freedom?
Edric scoffed.
There's no such thing. Freedom is a lonely road, and you're likely to not survive it.
He paused, expelling a breath.
At least this way, with the haunted shadows, I have a life, no matter how dismal it might be.
Mason's brow furrowed. Had he gone any further, you wouldn't even have that. A sombre smile split Edric's swollen cheeks, but the open eye remained devoid of emotion.
I know. I was unlucky.
Chapter 7. Fear. Raven wrenched at the leather reins, his chestnut gelding coming to an abrupt stop along the darkened tree line. Men fanned out around him, torches held aloft as they peered into the blackness beyond.
We'll go on foot from here,
Raven commanded, dismounting in a single leap. He tethered his horse to one of the trees, then patted his thigh, calling his hounds over. Freeing a pouch from his belt, he opened it, presenting his souvenirs from their previous wolf hunt, a tuft of fur and 4 canine teeth. The dogs immediately set to work, their truffle-like noses examining the pouch and its contents, then sent their snouts plunging to the ground. Shade released a deafening bark, dashing into the forest, Dusk in close pursuit. Drawing his sword, Raven followed in the hound's wake.
Ready your arms. We'll find this bastard before sunrise.
Men trailed behind him, weapons clattering and feet thumping against the undergrowth. Above them, the crescent moon could not abate the dimness of the crew's surroundings, the sliver of the celestial body barely visible through the clouds. The two hounds ran shoulder to shoulder ahead of the heavily armed mercenaries, leading the way deep into the woodlands. They yapped and snarled, blazing along the trail at maddening speed.
Hurry up, you fools!
Raven demanded of his men, glancing across his shoulder. More and more of them lagged behind, unable to maintain the pace. A sharp howl tore through the air, echoing amongst the trees before it morphed into a gut-wrenching squeal. Reaching a small clearing in the forest, Raven was met by a massive wolf, its jaws locked over Shade's leg. Discarding his torch, the flame dying out against the wet forest floor, he icily charged. He thrust his sword out, the blade scarcely missing the demon's flank. The creature whipped around, releasing Shade in the process, snapping at air beside Raven. Men quickly circled the area, their multitude of torches illuminating the massive creature in the middle. Amber eyes stared back at them, blood dripping from bared fangs, and a black coat shimmering in the flickering torchlight. The beast took a retreating step, but more men were gathering behind it. With its head held low, ears pressed flat against its skull, the demon released a dull growl. Black mist trickled down the wolf's legs, swirling out along the ground. Eyeing his men, Raven licked his lips in satisfaction. They stood tall, defying the fear-inducing demonic aura.
Charge!
Raven bellowed, swinging his sword around, slashing from side to side. He missed several times, the creature bounding and sidestepping away, but as other men closed in on it, Raven managed to drive his sword into the demon's shoulder. Like a madman, he continued to stab and lunge, ducked underneath the wolf's swiping claws, then blocked its gaping maw as it snapped at him. Arrows thudded into the beast, another man's sword slicing across its back. A spear arched across, lodging into its stomach. The wolf whimpered, claws swatting air and teeth flashing, yet it stood no chance. The humans had it surrounded, attacking from all angles. As the demon crumpled to the ground, the members of the haunted shadows brought their weapons up high in a cheer of gleeful victory. Raising an arm to silence the men, Raven gestured for the dead demon.
"Gather the carcass,"
he ordered, running his sword across its fur to clean the blade. Placing 2 fingers to his mouth, he whistled, his hounds padding over. Shade walked with a terrible limp, her back paw barely touching the ground. Her tongue lolled as she panted, her head drooping.
"Hurry up!"
Raven shouted, watching as his men scrambled around him. A thin log was brought forward, and the crew proceeded to tie the wolf's legs together around the makeshift wooden shaft, ready for it to be lifted and hauled away. Raven gave them a nod of acknowledgement.
"Just make sure to—"
With the mercenaries about to lug the dead demon away from the site, a blood-curdling howl rippled through the forest, interrupting their gruesome work. They all halted, peering in the direction of the noise, into the deep darkness of the woods. No one dared move, apart from the exchange of furtive glances. Even Raven had stopped, clenching his fists at the onset of damp palms. A branch snapped, then a tree thundered to the ground, pinning one of the men down. He released a scream as a set of sharp teeth snapped shut over his head, pulverizing his skull in a splosh of crimson. Black mists whooshed out around the beast, advancing through the undergrowth uncontrolled like a merciless hurricane of evil. One of the men broke into a run, another flung his sword at the demon before joining him, then more fled. As if drenched in icy waters, Raven felt himself shrink, tremors shooting down his legs. He shuffled a step back and whirled around, breaking into a run. He sprinted along with his men, Shade keeping pace despite her injury. Fear. It was not an accustomed emotion for Raven, but this was no ordinary fear. This was terror incarnate, a sensation so primal it wrenched into his soul. A scream tore through the woods behind him, then a stomach-turning crunch and a squelch of pulped flesh. Raven refused to look back. He needed to reach his horse and escape, to get away from the rampant monster raging behind them. Nothing else mattered. Edric ground out a breath ever so slowly. The slight movement sent his body into agony, and he felt as though he was being stabbed by hundreds of daggers. Inhaling was even worse, and he grabbed at his side in an attempt to alleviate the pain. His bruised hands and fingers offered no such luck, however, and he winced, gritting his teeth. Lying motionless on the cot, Edric focused on his breathing and how best to thwart the waves of discomfort. He kept his eyes shut, allowing his mind to travel elsewhere for a moment. He would think of the sunrise, how the glaring rays would warm his face, and the caress she would offer. The goddess. If only she hadn't abandoned him. Opening his eyes, Edric found that only one obliged, with the other still swollen shut. He blinked, attempting to clear his vision. The room was relatively light, illuminated by warm, reddish hues. It was likely early in the morning, the sun barely risen. He fought back another grunt as he pushed himself up, heaving his legs over the edge of the bed. It felt as if they were made from lead, his joints aching and grinding.
Is this how it feels to be 100 years old?
He wondered. The stench of vomit pricked his nose, and he looked down, finding the chamber pot yet to be emptied. Mason was asleep on the cot opposite, half slumped against the wall. Any attempt to stay awake on his part had undoubtedly failed. With great effort, Edric managed to use the chamber pot to relieve himself, then forced back a cry as he came to his feet. Taking his first tentative steps, he found walking easier than expected. He wouldn't have needed to brace himself against the wall had it not been for his still spinning head. The light of his surroundings stung his eyes, and any sound ceaselessly rang in his ears. He prayed the effects of his concussion would abate quickly. Otherwise, Raven's abuse would only continue to haunt him. Edric staggered for the door, his vision blurred and his long arms overreaching. He jerked, nearly going headfirst into the wood. It took another go for him to manage the latch and to leave the bedroom, with Mason in it, behind. The trek down the corridor felt a mile long, and worse yet was his descent to the staircase. Everything ached and throbbed, the youth barely able to stifle his grunts by the time he reached the ground floor. The innkeeper stood by the bar, cleaning away spilt drink and food across the counter as he noticed Edric's appearance. His eyes bulged, and his face lost most of its colour.
"I'm not dead,"
Edric rasped, finding his throat drier than anticipated. His breath caught, causing him to cough, the sudden motion tweaking his broken ribs. The pain fled. Doubling over, he stumbled forward, bumbling into a table and a set of chairs. The innkeeper dropped his towel, hurrying over. Reaching for Edric, he found his hand slapped aside.
"Don't touch me,"
Edric rumbled, glaring at him. He hawked, then spat a glob of congealed blood onto the floor.
"Stay away!"
The innkeeper raised his hands, taking a step back.
"I apologize, young sir. I only wanted to help. Would you like some food and drink, perhaps?"
Edric slumped onto one of the chairs, swearing at the added pain it caused, then silently nodded. As the innkeeper disappeared, he looked about the empty hall, being the sole customer at this early hour. The floor in front of the main entrance had been cleaned since the previous night, but the remnants of his own blood were no less visible. The stain was much larger than he had anticipated, and the mere sight of it made him shudder. He forced himself to look elsewhere, leaning forward with his elbows on the table. It wasn't long until the innkeeper's wife appeared, carrying a bowl of porridge and a cup of fresh water.
"On the house,"
she smiled, yet the courtesy was left unreturned. Curtsying, she retreated back to the kitchen. His stomach rumbling, Edric wasted no time downing his breakfast. Even though the porridge was all but tasteless, the softness of the food suited his bruised face, and he chewed with care to spare his loosened teeth. He had learned early on that if he were careful enough and let the teeth be, they would strengthen and set within the gums again. It had worked before, so he hoped it would do so again. Edric soon pushed the empty bowl away, finishing the last of his water before placing the cup on the table. It was still early in the morning, but the sunlight cast shorter and shorter shadows outside the tavern windows. Creaking sounded behind Edric. "You made it down on your own, I see." Twisting in his seat, Edric looked over his shoulder. "How are you feeling?" Mason inquired, descending the final steps of the staircase. Edric scowled, but it was barely noticeable through the swelling of his face.
"Alive?"
Grinning, Mason walked past him, sitting down opposite. "Better than dead, I suppose."
"Depends on who you ask."
Mason's expression soured. "Well, I'm asking you."
"Then no."
A curt nod signalled Mason's understanding. "May I still sit with you?" Biting at his busted lip, Edric paused before speaking.
"Do as you want."
Mason had thankfully eaten in quiescence. Receiving a bowl similar to that of Edric's, he had downed his breakfast within minutes of arriving. Edric had wanted to leave all along, but he lacked the strength, dreading each movement, racking his every limb. It wasn't worth the effort, and he couldn't avoid wondering, was the recruit growing on him? Angling against the table, Mason decided to break the silence. "Have you considered my offer?" Edric frowned. "Offer? Yes. To go join the priesthood." "You still don't get it, do you?" Edric sighed. "I can't leave." "I know you said that, but what does that even mean? It's not like Raven watches your every move." Leaning back in his seat, Edric was about to fold his arms over his chest when the pain stopped him. "No, but—" He hesitated, looking elsewhere. "You wouldn't understand." "Wouldn't understand what?" "Please, just leave it." Mason's brow drew together. "Why can't you tell me? What hold does he have on you?" Rubbing at his neck, Edric opened his mouth to reply, only to be cut short by the onset of roaring thunder outside the inn. The characteristic thudding of a throng of horses reverberated out on the street, then dropped to silence. Shouting followed, and the front door swung inward with a bang, men milling through the opening.
"Milton and Owen, fetch bandages,"
Raven ordered, pointing to the stairs, and the men scurried away without complaint. Dusk and shade slipped through the entrance, squeezing past legs and feet. They almost tripped a man, but managed to find their owner in the bustle. Shade hobbled along with a limp, and Dusk had a rip across his flank. Another couple of mercenaries entered, hauling a third between them. The man carried was missing the bottom part of a leg, the grisly stump leaving a trail of blood along the floor. His open eyes stared aimlessly into the distance. He was already dead. Frantically gesturing at the various tables, Raven directed each of his men as they entered the tavern. Plenty of them were injured, and yet another was carried in by his arms and legs. By the looks of it, he too was dead. Mason rose from his seat, approaching their leader. "What's going on, sir? What's happened?"
"Shut up, farm boy,"
Raven barked, his eyes piercing as he glared at the recruit.
"Go fetch the rest of our horses. We'll be leaving."
Mason snapped up straight, offering an awkward salute before bolting for the door. "What the hell was all that?" Einhard demanded, his shaking voice tinged with alarm. Stepping up to Raven, he stared at him.
"That was a fool's errand. What's going on? What have you done?"
A clenched fist slammed into Einhard's jaw, and the man staggered back.
"You'd better hold your tongue, you bastard,"
Raven shouted, his dog snarling beside him.
"But why go for demons? We have enough coin,"
Einhard argued, rubbing at his reddening chin.
"There is no coin. None. And the creditors will soon arrive with their army of royal knights, unless we leave this cursed place."
Raven whipped around to face his gathered crew, and was met by a sea of open expressions, wide eyes, and hunched postures. Never had they looked so sorry as they did now.
"Stem any bleeding and gather your gear. We're not staying around a minute longer than necessary."
Men leveraged themselves upright, shoving each other aside as they headed for the stairs.
"But where are we meant to go?"
Einhard questioned, ignoring the fact that no one was left to listen except Raven and Edric, and the youth only watched from a distance, not uttering a word.
"I don't know,"
Raven gravely admitted, clawing at the nape of his neck. He turned, about to join the rest of his men upstairs, as he heard his name called.
"Raven, sir!"
It was a young member of the Haunted Shadows coming through the front door. He gestured for the street.
"There's someone outside asking for you."
All the blood left Raven's face as he shot a glance at Einhard.
"You're coming with me,"
he hissed through gritted teeth. Edric pushed himself upright, stalking behind the men and stopping in the doorway. Unwilling to expose himself to another beating, He listened from a distance, watching a leather-clad man hand a parchment scroll to Raven.
"What's this?"
Raven questioned.
"Word from dog,"
came the answer, and the messenger motioned to leave as Raven clutched his arm.
"Where is he?"
"Abissa. He won't be coming."
The messenger wrenched himself free, then stalked away in silence. Spitting on the ground, Raven swore, unrolling the parchment. He pored over the document, his eyes running across the surface.
"Tinta,"
he proclaimed, a grin splitting his face.
"We're going to Tinta."
Chapter 8. Connections. For the first time since the beginning of summer, the haunted shadows left the capital to set up camp elsewhere. They rode north, but refrained from entering the township of Tinta as they arrived. Instead, they headed across an abutting field, settling down along the forest tree line on the other side. Partially obscured by a copse and a set of wild bushes, it was just after sunset as the band gathered around a fire, the dying sunlight fading over the horizon. Given a pair of new boots and a fresh shirt, courtesy of one of his dead crewmates, Edric painstakingly worked to erect his shelter. He was the only one yet to finish as night fell over the campsite. His usually nimble fingers struggled with tying the various knots, the skin of his hands angry and purple. His joints would barely bend due to the swelling, the pain stinging him for each rope he tightened. The tent was small, but at least he would be left on his own again. Perhaps that would allow him better sleep, which he greatly needed, especially now, after the excruciating ride from the capital. Broken ribs and a bouncing horse had never been a particularly comfortable combination. Looking at the sky, Edric gazed at the crescent moon. It was blurry, his vision still not completely cleared from the night before, but he could nonetheless make out the shape, which was an improvement in itself. If his sight did not mend soon, it would significantly limit his aim were they to enter combat. A light breeze whirled past, carrying the scent of cooking. Edric could feel his stomach tighten. He hadn't eaten since morning, his hands quivering from lack of sustenance. A final knot saw the tent firmly fastened to the grassy surface, and Edric rose with a grunt, brushing debris from his trousers. Walking across the campsite, he joined the other men by their central bonfire, its flames flickering high against the sky above. Edric moved silently, his brisk pace allowing him a short stop at what was left over from dinner, a half-eaten roasted hog. The crew had been lucky on their hunt as they had first arrived outside Tinta, having scored such prey for their first evening. They were quickly devouring the charred meat, with Edric being one of the last to enjoy the food. His knife whipped out to carve away several slices, and he gathered them in a bowl before carefully seating himself atop a felled log on the grass. He managed to find a spot along one end, the closest man seated being Mason. Quietly eating, Edric watched Ironheart pacing back and forth on the opposite side of the bonfire.
"Why couldn't we have taken up residence at the local inn?"
Ironheart muttered in question, shooting daggers at Raven.
"Because the creditors will find us there,"
Raven replied, returning the stare.
"We can't risk staying inside the town longer than necessary."
Ironheart chortled, unamused.
"Well, where are we going anyway? What else did dogs let us say?"
In silence, Raven retrieved the parchment from a pouch attached to his belt, presenting it to him.
"Go ahead."
"Hilarious,"
Ironheart grumbled, ripping the scroll from him. Handing it to Gavin, who sat beside Raven, he folded his arms across his chest.
"Read it out loud."
Accepting the small scroll, Gavin scrutinized its contents in silence, despite the given instructions. His eyebrows shot up.
"What? Why are we to accept an assignment that Cyrus believes is too good to be true?"
Einhard's mouth fell open.
What? What does it say?
What he believes and what is correct isn't necessarily the same,
Raven told them.
Fine, but why go still?
Gavin asked.
We shouldn't even need to risk it.
Einhard slapped the scroll out of Gavin's hand, grabbing it to make an attempt at reading the handwriting, but quickly conceded.
Sod it!
He threw the parchment on the ground.
What's happened anyway? Why have we got no coin? The tomb!
Edric blurted before he could retract the answer off his tongue. He fumbled with his bowl, dropping the food. Einhard spun towards him.
The what? Did you just say the tomb?
He glared back at Raven, his voice rising.
Did you gamble it all away?
Raven's icy regard shattered, twisting into rage and malice in a darkness not often seen. His jaw locked, veins bulging up his neck as he flung his own food aside, lunging for Edric. Attempting to dodge the initial attack, Edric only managed to roll aside, the shooting pain from his ribs causing him to crumple onto the ground. A balled fist connected with his face, blood gushing from his nose. Raven came over him, sending another swing for his head as he screamed,
"You traitorous pile of dung! Yesterday wasn't enough, then I take it!"
Edric let his arms fall to the ground as he held Raven's gaze.
What are you going to do this time?
He wheezed.
Kill me! Just do it already!
A glint of metal flashed from Raven's belt.
I should do to you what that blasted northerner did to me. You've ruined my life!
Confused, Edric opened his mouth to speak but was silenced by the blade slicing through his shirt. The sharpened edge ran just short of his skin as Raven jerked back.
Oi, stuff it already!
Clutching Raven's shirt, Mason hauled him away from Edric.
Haven't you done enough? Mason, no!
Edric exclaimed, but pain exploded on his chin, whipping him back onto the ground. Men around them shifted, several retreating into the shadows, yet no one said a word. Einhard dropped back behind the bonfire, out of sight. Raven flexed his fingers, his knuckles red from the punch. He rose and spun, gaining hold of Mason's collar. Flicking his wrist, he sent the tip of his blade up, grazing the recruit's throat.
"What the hell do you think you're doing?"
But please,
Mason whispered, hands held out in defeat.
I'm only looking after all of you.
With a glimpse over his shoulder, Raven narrowed his eyes, his grin growing sinister.
"Have you made a friend, pretty boy?"
All the colour drained from Edric's face as he watched a drop of blood trickle down Mason's neck. He shook his head, his open eye round and glossy.
"What did I tell you about making friends?"
Raven demanded, his voice deepening to a thunder. Mason's expression screwed up, his brow rising as he visibly swallowed.
Sir,
"Shut up!"
Raven shouted, then repeated his prompt to Edric, more forceful this time.
"What did I tell you about making friends?"
A moment of silence passed, then blood gushed down Raven's arm. Gurgling sounded, Mason's eyes rolling back into his head as he crumpled to the ground. Edric jolted forward, crawling across the grass to reach him. "No!" he cried, his ungainly fingers clamping over Mason's throat, but the blood continued to pour out from the grievous wound. Fingers twitched, the sound of a ragged wheeze leaving Mason a final time. His empty stare reached into nothingness, his chest no longer moving. A tug to Edric's hair snapped his head back, and he found himself staring up into Raven's face.
"There is always something worse I can do to you,"
he rumbled.
"So don't you dare challenge me, and never make friends. I thought I had taught you this. Did you learn nothing from Corey?"
Everything turned into a blur, eyes watering, the salt of Edric's tears stinging his battered face.
You bastard!
He screamed, surging up at their leader, slamming a fist into his jaw. Raven jerked back but quickly recovered, his powerful grip finding its way onto Edric's wrists. He forced him down, immobilizing him against the ground, then tore at his shirt. The moment Edric's clothing ripped open, exposing his battered chest, his whole body flooded with dread. The coldness spread like a snowstorm in the dead of winter, numbing his limbs and obstructing his hastened breathing. He began kicking at Raven, clawing at the ground to get away.
Don't spoil the mood now, pretty boy.
Raven grimly chuckled, clutching Edric's ankle and yanking him close.
Please, don't do this. Let me go,
Edric pleaded, tears smearing across his dirt-stained cheeks. Straining against Raven's hold, he powered through, rolling over to his hands and knees as the grip loosened.
Go ahead, then. Leave,
Raven challenged, kicking him across the back. His breath catching, Edric halted. Each of the men stared at him, eyes wide, but they were yet to make a sound. On the ground, below the bonfire, Mason lay in a pool of his own blood. A final look at Raven, and Edric bolted for the tree line. He needed to get away, to go anywhere but here. Not just from the camp, or Tinter, or the capital, but away from everything. Darkness fell upon the forest, the undergrowth thickening and branches seemingly reaching for Edric as he hurried past. The taste of iron laced his tongue, and the agony in his chest only heightened his grief and the overwhelming sense of guilt. A chill crept down his spine, the sound of snapping and rustling building behind him. Growls rolled out, a bark cracking through the air. Closer and closer they came, and Edric knew it wasn't going to be long. They would soon be upon him. Edric slammed onto the ground, pain erupting from his calf as dusk bit into the muscle. He struggled to free himself, belting out a scream, but the dog's teeth only sank deeper into his flesh. His surroundings shifted and muddled, slowly fading. Trees spun around him, the sky above losing its stars.
You really thought I'd let you go?
Raven's voice rippled through the haze.
I bought you, pretty boy.
He paused, his words ringing in Edric's ears.
You are forever mine.
In the light of pre-dawn, Raven and a few of his closest men approached an unassuming one-story building outside of Tinter. It was situated alongside the road leading east on a modest property walled off by a 5-foot fence. A lantern dangled in one of the windows as they arrived by the entrance, and the door swung open before any of them were allowed a chance to knock. "Come in, good sirs," greeted a middle-aged gentleman, his eyes darting beyond the entrance before he stepped aside. Dressed in a well-tailored outfit made from shimmering blue silk, he appeared much too rich for such humble accommodation. But the men entered. They trailed behind him as they came into what seemed to be a reception room. A fire churned in the hearth, the furnishings sparse, only a few chairs propped up against a table at the centre. "For obvious reasons, I could not meet you at my home," the gentleman explained.
I don't care,
Raven flatly stated.
Give us the instructions, as well as an advance on the promised coin, and you'll have your brother killed.
The gentleman paled, his eyebrows elevating. How did you...
A lucky guess or experience? Doesn't matter. You want him dead because he inherited your family estate, I assume.
Yes, but...
And you're next in line?
Yes?
Where does he live?
The gentleman dabbed a handkerchief onto his forehead, removing sweat. West. My father owned all the land west of Tinter, to the border of Rover, none of which is mine. He took a deep breath, licking his lips. My brother is expected home this evening, and his personal guard is thankfully reduced due to the recent expansion of the priesthood. The priests have recruited many of his men.
It will be done by tonight.
Raven folded his arms.
Now, The reimbursement.
Fumbling inside one of his pockets, the gentleman retrieved a gold coin, handing it to Raven. "The rest, once the deed is done," he said, his resolute expression not quite matching his shaking voice.
Very well.
Raven dipped his chin, then turned, walking past his men.
We'll be back to collect our pay before sunrise tomorrow.
The cold air of autumn seeped through the canvas walls of Edric's tent. The sun barely showed its presence this day, its light soon gone, and replaced with the same damned darkness that resided within his own soul. For what else was there inside him? He was cursed, forsaken, destitute, beaten, and broken. Curled up on his bedroll, Edric shut his eyes for the goddess knows how many times this day, praying for his agony to end. Not only did his body scream for relief, but his mind wished his inner turmoil, the terrifying darkness, would disperse. Yet he wasn't strong enough, neither in body nor in spirit. Unable to will himself outside, Edric had not attended any of the meals, and his water skin was empty. His mind swam, and his surroundings were distorted and muddled from pain and exhaustion. Indeed, he was forsaken. But perhaps it would finally end tonight. Shuffling sounded from the men inhabiting the campsite, hooves thudding over the grass and the distinct clattering of equipment. They were readying to leave. Heaving himself out of bed, Edric pressed a hand to his side, gritting his teeth. His leg throbbed, and he struggled to pull his boot on due to the swelling from the dog's bite. Taking a tentative step, he winced, barely able to put enough pressure on the foot to walk. It was going to be a long night. With his quiver strap tightened and his bow in hand, Edric left the confines of his tent. He immediately stopped at the entrance, gulping down a breath. Before him were the remnants of yesterday's bonfire, and beside it, the ominous dark stain, a grim reminder of what would happen should anyone ever defy Raven's orders. A shudder shook Edric to the core as he thought about how the men had so casually carried Mason's body away and dumped it in the forest for the animals to feast upon. Never would he receive a burial, or his family ever know about his fate. Mason was gone, his naivety having been the death of him.
Get your ass up on that horse, boy!
Raven snarled from the saddle of his gelding, ripping Edric from his reverie.
Don't think you will be spared from this just because you got beat up.
He spat a glob of phlegm on the ground, then ushered his mount forward. Edric watched him leave as he heard a familiar snort. He turned towards the sound, finding his own horse silently grazing beside his shelter. His swollen eye had hidden its presence, even though someone had already led the animal forward. Despite only being harnessed with a bridle, the horse was ready to head out. In his 10 years as an outlaw, Edric was yet to be gifted his first saddle, and he had never been able to afford one of his own. With a whistle, Edric called the horse over, and it approached light-footed. He clicked his tongue, and the mare responded without delay, kneeling down in the grass. A sigh of relief left Edric as he smiled. Thank God He stopped himself. No, he wouldn't thank her. Not once had he received anything for free in this life. He had always struggled for survival, fighting his way through instability and peril. Never would he thank a deity for offering such a lowly existence. Mounting up, Edric grabbed the reins and gently pulled at them. The mare rose, then bounded into a trot. The ride felt much longer than the leagues of which it consisted. Every bounding step the mare took sent jolts of pain through Edric's chest, his head violently throbbing. Flickering lights swam across his field of vision, and he swore inwardly, his fingers white as he gripped the reins. He couldn't afford to relax now, or he'd risk sliding off the damned horse. All he could do was steel himself and focus on surviving. Or maybe not. he hadn't yet decided. Surrounded by vast fields of grass, the road was narrow but well maintained, an alameda of birch trees flanking both sides. Had it not been so dark, Edric imagined he would have been able to see the yellow hues speckling the crown of the trees. A cold breeze swept through the canopying leaves, loosening some of the greenery to trickle down around the members of the haunted shadows. As the mansion rose over the yonder, Raven signalled for his crew to slow, eventually stopping at a safe distance. Steering away to one side, Edric gave him a wide berth. Raven grinned viciously, disconcertingly excited about this particular outing. The many months since their last raid had left the men restless. Edric had thought the frightening demon hunts would have dampened their fighting spirits, but that did not seem to be the case. Each of the mercenaries beamed, their horses clattering hooves and shifting hither and yon over the road. They sought redemption for their latest, failed hunt. Long shadows stretched along the ground, the crescent moon above casting its icy light onto the world. Edric wished he could make out the stars glowing in the darkness, but everything at a distance was an annoying blur. How he was meant to successfully land an arrow was beyond him, yet he needed to try, and preferably not fail if he wished to avoid further punishment.
"Gavin and Sparks!"
Raven called, the ranks behind him shifting. 2 men rode forward, joining his side.
"Scout around the walls. Find a way inside."
Urging their horses on, Gavin and Sparks sped up, bolting off in the direction of the mansion. Raven held up a hand, pulling his reins.
"The rest, halt!"
he commanded.
"We'll await their return."
The sound of clapping hooves soon re-emerged, and horses appeared in the distance. The 2 scouts returned, stopping before Raven. Gavin jerked a thumb towards the mansion. "The wall isn't particularly high, sir. There seem to be 3 larger buildings within the premises, and another 2 smaller ones. However, there's only one entrance." Raven nodded.
"The main entrance it is, then. How many sentries?"
2 at the gate, another 2 patrolling inside the walls. Can't say how many might guard the home, though."
"Wouldn't be much more,"
Raven huffed.
"Never is."
He spun in the saddle, addressing the rest of his men.
"Ready your arms, and let the shadows haunt 'em."
The mercenaries roared, their weapons shooting for the sky before they heeled their mounts into a sprint. They thundered along the road, no longer concerned with attacking under the cover of darkness. Edric clapped his boots against his mare's flanks, following suit, but a coldness wrapped around him. Raven was exultant as the crew advanced on the mansion, likely already feeling the weight of the promised coin in his pouch, believing it would soon be a reality. But something was amiss. Even if a local law decided to employ fewer guards, the number of those accounted for by the scouts was bordering on ridiculous. Raven would have paid attention to such an important detail had he not been so blind, wholly deprived of judgment by his greed and desperation. Was he not only at the end of his tethers, but also his sanity? Raven swung his sword out, speeding past the first guard. The blade dug into the man's neck, severing the head from the body. Crimson fountained, the head flopping sideways as the body dropped. Einhard granted the other guard a similar fate, his sword digging deep into the sentry's chest. Blood gurgled and spilt from his mouth before he sagged to the ground. Already dismounted, Gavin and Richard pushed the gates open, allowing the rest of the crew entrance to the mansion courtyard. Torches lined an expansive area of cobblestones, and a massive, elaborate carriage stood at its centre, both attestations of the stately wealth of whatever noble resided there. Alerted to the mercenaries' presence, the second pair of guards patrolling the area came running, fearlessly swinging their swords at the intruders. Edric slid down his horse, attempting to only put weight on his good leg, but failed. He winced, fumbling with his bow. As he managed to nock an arrow, Raven was already upon the guards, obscuring any chance for true aim. Raven chuckled, deflecting a lunge from one of the guards. Their swords locked, and Raven twisted his blade, sending his opponent's weapon flying out of his hand. Dusk pounced, fangs biting down over the sentry's arm. A merciless stab saw the guard dead, and Einhard, running up beside them, dispatched the other just as swiftly.
"Move for the doors!"
Raven ordered, men dismounting all around him. Dusk and shade circled him, the bitch still limping with each step. The large crew marched across the courtyard as a sudden bang boomed out behind them, echoing within the walls. The gate had been forced shut, and the front doors of the mansion whipped outwards. 2 rows of archers came into view, releasing arrows into the members of the haunted shadows. Edric dived under the spray of death whooshing overhead, landing heavily atop the cobbled ground. Scrambling to get up on his feet, he froze in place as a scream rippled out at the front. Einhard fell to his knees, with Gavin already lying motionless beside him, and Richard crumbled with an arrow protruding from his forehead. Sparks went next, then Tiny and Leroy. Without shields to protect them, the front row of men went down within moments. Bizarrely undeterred, Raven raised his sword and bellowed his charge. The archers inside the mansion doors stepped aside, making way for several heavily armoured warriors. Their protective gear shone in the flickering torchlight, draping cloaks whipping at their heels as they advanced. Swallowing a breath, Edric could barely believe his eyes. Royal knights! Coming to his feet, he knocked his arrow again, drew, and let loose, but the projectile did nothing against the metal armour. Retrieving another arrow from his quiver, Edric made a second attempt. His hands were shaking, and the blur of his vision cursed his aim. Again, the shaft connected with the metal armour, but then dropped to the ground, leaving the knight unharmed. As the knights moved away from the open doors, the archers reappeared, releasing another wave of lethal projectiles. A blood-curdling squeal sounded, like a distressed horse's neigh, outdrawn and sharp. Edric spun at the sound, his loyal mare toppling over with an arrow through her throat. He headed for her, but men thronged around him shouting, the clash of metal only heightening. Additional royal knights appeared, another group charging the mercenaries from the stable building. Outnumbered and overwhelmed, men panicked, some attempting to scale the walls, others throwing themselves helplessly at the enemy. Edric's arms fell to his sides, his bow clattering against the ground. All was lost. The haunted shadows were at an end. Chapter 9. Noble Blood. Lined up in the courtyard, the surviving members of the haunted shadows had their hands and feet shackled. Edric stood at the very end, not far from Raven. Unable to remove his eyes from the brutal scene, Edric stared at the growing pile of corpses outside the mansion. "The rest of you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder," a man proclaimed, emerging from the front doors. A breath rushing into his lungs, Edric immediately recognized the unruly mop of brown hair on the nobleman's head. He didn't even need to see the sky-coloured eyes up close. It was the man from the tomb. Walking out onto the courtyard, the nobleman came to an abrupt halt. "Raven?" He stepped up to the leader, his eyebrows lifting. "Fancy seeing you here. Goddess, this was a lucky strike." He swiftly eyed the rest of the mercenaries, his gaze settling on Edric. "Oh, and your little boy slave as well. Poor him. Perhaps he would have been better off sold, considering how this debacle was resolved." Metal clinked as a royal knight approached, joining the nobleman's side. "The rest have been detained, Lord Urchinwine," he reported. The nobleman opened his mouth to respond as Raven rattled his shackles.
Urchin wine!
He exclaimed, not a single speck of colour left on his face. Ah, yes, did I fail to mention that detail? The king and I share ancestors, hence his support in this endeavour, and your inevitable death. Frankly, it is quite satisfying to see it all come together. I had thought my hunt for you and your disgraceful crew of misfits would take an awful lot of time, yet here you are. He held his arms out, his gesture encompassing the entire row of mercenaries. Angling his head towards the royal knight, he added, "It is all a great shame. Even if I knew my brother would not let this opportunity slip. I had wished he was smarter, but alas, he is not. Have men sent for his arrest, and move the bodies to the fire pit, but don't burn them. Bury them." "But, my lord—" "No! Damn the men who dare make an attempt on my life! The same goes for the rest of them. Have them loaded onto the wagons for the trial. Then they shall all be sealed beneath the earth following their execution." Barking sounded, and Lord Urchinwine spun to find some of his guards chasing Raven's hounds. "And capture those damned dogs! Their yapping is making my head hurt." "As you wish, my lord," the knight replied, then walked away, shouting orders at the rest of Lord Urchinwine's men. As if thinking Raven had any interest in his business, Lord Urchinwine faced him, rambling on. "Very unfortunate. Very unfortunate indeed. The king will be saddened by the news of my brother's duplicity and subsequent arrest, regardless of previous suspicions." Clenching his jaw, Raven whipped his bound hands out, pulling at the chains. A wicked smile split Lord Urchinwine's cheeks. "There will not be enough time for you to escape, I'm afraid. As the local lord and guardian of Tinta, I am also the acting judiciary. There will be no trial. You will all hang at sunrise, including my brother." Resistance was useless at this point. With his ankles bound by fetters, chains rattled behind Edric as he shuffled forward amongst the other prisoners. Lord Urchinwine's brother wailed at the far back, face smeared with snot and tears, but he was barely heard over the chattering crowd gathered below the gallows. 3 men walked before Edric, Raven closest behind. His proximity brought cold shivers down Edric's back, but he found solace in knowing it would soon all be over. Lord Urchinwine climbed the stairs onto the gallows, holding his arms out to address the crowd. "Today there shall be an execution unheard of here in Tinta. An entire thieves' band, guilty of attempted murder of none other than myself. They were recruited by my own flesh and blood, my brother, Alford Urchinwine, who shall also suffer the noose." A sharp intake of air could be heard from the onlookers, then cursing and zealous prayers to the goddess. Only a moment passed before the first piece of fruit was flung, hitting a mercenary in the head, then another. Tension within the crowd quickly intensified, forcing Lord Urchinwine to raise his voice considerably. "Townsfolk of Tinta, hear me!" The situation calmed, but muttering and swearing persisted. "Each of these men shall have their punishment, and you will all be granted the opportunity to watch and enjoy this moment of retribution." Men and women cheered and whistled, attempting to move closer, elbowing each other as they were increasingly short on space. "Bring the first men forward!" Guards pointed their spears and swords at the members of the Haunted Shadows, ushering them on. A total of 5 men could fit onto the gallows at one time, and Edric ended up the second from the left, the rising sun beaming down on him. His swollen eye just about allowed him a slit to see through, and he turned his face into the glaring rays. The headsman walked up to each of the 5 men, placing a noose around their necks. He tightened them, testing each with a pull before moving on to the next man. Edric's calf throbbed, his head ached, and his chest pained him like never before, yet the warmth felt surreal, almost heavenly, against his face on this last time in the sun. He accepted his fate. It was long overdue anyway. Only one point still bothered him, a final piece of information he wanted to know, needed to know. Tears trickled down his cheeks as he turned for Raven. "Please, for once, tell me, where is my mother? What happened to her?" Raven gave him a sideward glance.
Your mother?
He snorted a laugh.
Whatever goddess-forsaken town I took you from, it doesn't matter. Your mother's long since dead.
He grinned, flashing yellowed teeth at the youth.
And you won't be joining her where you're going.
Edric whimpered, sobs racking through his body. "Please, Raven!" he begged him, but was only granted another cackle in return. "Please tell me where she lived!" All his pleadings fell on deaf ears. Pain, unlike any other, shook Edric to the bones, his heart shattering into 1,000 pieces. A last inner prayer echoed inside his mind, begging for the goddess to show mercy on him through death, for her to accept him into the afterlife, not damn him to eternity within the dark abyss.
"See you in hell, pretty boy,"
came Raven's last words before the headsman opened the latch beneath him. He dropped like a stone, his neck snapping in an instant. The headsman moved to stand beside Edric and the lever that controlled the latch beneath him. His hand hovered above it, ready for when the command came. Turning his head towards the sun, Edric exhaled, feeling the heat caressing his face. Maybe she had heard him, if only this once. Holding his breath, he readied himself for his moment of death. "Halt!" called Lord Urchinwine, and a collective gasp swept across the crowd, but silence settled as he raised a hand. "The High Priest demands a stay of execution." The steps onto the gallows creaked, then footfalls neared. Edric dared not look at what caused the sound, squeezing his eyes shut. A towering shape blocked the sunlight on Edric's face, a shadow looming over him. "Release the boy," demanded an emphatic yet calm man's voice. "The boy?" questioned the headsman. "Do as he says," Lord Urchinwine commanded. Muttering to himself, the headsman unfastened the noose around Edric's neck, lifting the rope over his head. Drawing on the last vestiges of his courage, Edric braved to open his eyes. He found the backlit form of a tall man before him, the person dressed in layers of black robes. "The goddess shines her light upon you, my son," he proclaimed for everyone to hear, silencing the few remaining whispers within the crowd. Turning, he began walking away. "Come, follow me." Edric looked about the raised platform as though unsure to whom the man spoke. Raven hung from his rope, and the 3 men to his right still had nooses tied around their necks. The strange man halted on the stairs, half turning towards Edric. He seemed to be in his 60s, his brown hair salted grey, and a soft grin showing upon his clean-shaven face. "I am not about to wait, son. Hurry up." Shuffling a step forward, Edric winced, his injured leg throbbing. "Get on with it, then," the headsman rumbled, pushing him towards the stairs. Edric staggered, barely missing a plunge down Raven's hatch as he regained his balance. With no other choice, he moved for the stranger. But was it really the High Priest? Here, in Tinter. And now, of all times. Unstable steps brought Edric down to solid ground, and he stopped before the supposed high priest. "Come," the old man said, gesturing to a horse and wagon standing along the far side of the square. A woman was perched on the front seat, holding the reins. Seeming to be in her 30s, with black hair cropped short, she observed their approach, her expression resolute. Edric limped behind the old man, his hands and feet still shackled, but remained silent. He only watched the two strangers as they wordlessly greeted one another. "Your Holiness," the woman questioned, her face that of stone. "Have faith, Adina," he merely replied, then motioned Edric to turn. Facing the gallows, they witnessed group after group of men being brought up onto the raised platform and subsequently hanged. Many died from the initial drop, but others thrashed and squirmed, slowly suffocating from their tightened nooses. Edric wasn't sure how to respond or how he should feel. His body seemed unnaturally empty, void of any soul or emotion. His inner self had already shut down. Perhaps he too had died upon the gallows like the rest, except that he remained walking. As the very last members of the haunted shadows had nooses wrapped around their throats, Edric felt his knees buckle, his world spinning, and everything went dark. "Why, though, Your Holiness? Why him?" Adina questioned, whipping the reins onto the draft horse. It leaned further into its harness, the wagon jerking as it sped up. The high priest sat forward, resting his elbows upon his knees. "In truth, simple. The goddess." Adina gave him a flat look, but said nothing. "I believe he is the one in my vision," the high priest continued, undeterred. "As far as I am aware, there is nothing redeeming about a criminal, let alone a murderer for hire." Adina glanced over her shoulder, the youth curled up at the back of the wagon. He remained unconscious, despite their attempts to wake him. "A cutthroat being young is no reason to save him. I do not and will not trust him. Why in the name of the goddess you took his restraints away, I will never understand." The high priest smiled. "At the end of the day, faith is all we have, and faith is what we need in this undertaking, including yours, for I would like you to train him." Facing him, Adina scowled. "Train him? Your Holiness, are you honestly about to place a sword in this boy's hands? A thug and murderer? Likely also a thief and burglar and whatever else he spent his days doing. Are we truly to teach him the powers of the light?" "We are indeed," the high priest confirmed, "and I would like it to be done by Catrin and yourself. Granted, the boy still has to agree, but that is my plan. He will be given the best guidance we have to offer, and the goddess shall supply the rest." Adina sighed. "I will do as you say, you know that, Your Holiness, but I beg you to be cautious. Stagger his training. Make sure he is trustworthy." The high priest's brow drew together. "I have a feeling he might not be the fastest to reconcile with his new living. Thus, there will likely be more than enough time." "True. However, I will not have Anaya tainted by his company. Allow the boy to heal before they are grouped up for training, and do not speak to her about his background." Smiling, the high priest rubbed his chin. "You might be right, my child, although I doubt his presence or his past would be damaging for Anaya. I shall heed your word, as long as you tutor him." "I will tutor him as steadfastly as I do Anaya, Your Holiness," Adina pledged. "Very good. Inform Catrin upon arrival, and summon him for a conference." The ground rocked beneath Edric, the sun relentlessly glaring down from above. He forced his eyes open, finding the low walls of a wagon around him. He lay at the very back, atop layers of pelts that cushioned the wooden floor. On the front seat sat the high priest and the woman he had called Adina. They were talking, but Edric couldn't make out the words, and even if he could, he would never have been able to respond, for his throat was as dry as the Canadesian deserts. His tongue nearly stuck to the roof of his mouth. Sitting forward, he forced back a whine as his back cracked, his chest granting him another stab of pain, although not as severe as he had expected. Edric braced himself against the floor, placing his hand on what felt like soft leather. Looking down, he found a filled water skin. His lips drew back in a smile, but he winced as the skin split, the taste of blood reaching the tip of his tongue. Not only had he found water, but he also noticed the lack of shackles on his wrists, and his ankles were no longer fettered. He had been freed. Grabbing the water skin, he drank the fluid in big gulps, draining the entire container in seconds. Bringing the water skin down, Edric flinched as he noticed his hand. The skin looked normal, no longer purple and bruised. He swallowed, tentatively reaching for his face. The swelling was gone, only slight tenderness left in its place. Not even his leg pained him as he flexed his calf muscles. The area was barely sore. Edric had only ever heard about the priesthood and their powers of the light. He had thought it a myth that the light could heal, but now he wasn't so sure. Wiping his mouth with his sleeve, Edric looked about the wagon, scrutinizing the rest of its contents. Barrels lined one side, but most of the bed held boxes and piles of clothing, robes made from black linen. The hems were lined with intricate patterns, yet the rest of the garments seemed plain. Black robes? Healing? A high priest? Were they truly part of the priesthood? Adina drove the horse at speed, steering with precision along a road no wider than the wagon. Fields flanked either side of the path, forests only visible in the distance. There was no town in sight, and the height of the sun suggested it was close to noon. Edric's heart thumped in his chest. He had been saved, even healed, but for what reason? Why would the priesthood ever affiliate themselves with someone such as him? Something didn't add up, and Edric wasn't about to stay around to find out what. Clamping a hand to the top box board, he vaulted over the edge, hitting the ground with a thud. He rolled to reduce the impact, using the momentum as he bolted into a sprint. He heard voices behind him, the wagon screeching and creaking. "Wait!" the high priest called, yet to no avail. Edric refused to heed his command, running as fast as he could. His breath hitched as his bruised ribs still plagued him, and darkness soon edged his vision. Tears pricked the corners of his eyes, his mind screaming for salvation. He couldn't allow himself to be caught. Not again. Footfalls stomped behind him, undoubtedly gaining on him. Lights flashed, his muscles spasmed and cramped, and his mind swam. Exhausted as he was from days with scarcely any food or drink, Edric finally crumbled. He fell headlong into the tall grass, a soft whine escaping his cracked lips. A slender foot came down before his face, layers of fabric rippling around someone's legs. The figure knelt before him, hands extended in a flash of light. "He's fine, Your Holiness. I believe he is only fatigued." More footsteps sounded. "Good," the high priest replied, joining Adina's side. "You will need to stand, my son. Walk back to the wagon." Edric coughed, straining to place his arms underneath him. His vision cleared as heat rose to his face. "Sod you and your priesthood!" he snarled, spittle flying at their feet. He tensed, expecting a retaliation, yet none came. "Have faith, Your Holiness?" Adina questioned, folding her arms over her chest. "Yes, my child," the high priest replied, his posture relaxed. "Pray, what is your name, son?" "None of your damned business!" Edric shouted, powering to lift himself away from the ground, but he came up short, falling back down. He rolled over on his side, his body spent, his chest rasping with every breath. Kneeling beside him, the high priest met his gaze, his brown eyes kind.
I want you to come with us.
Why? Edric shot back. Why me? Adina's lips flattened, but she said nothing. Did you purchase me? Edric then asked, staring up at them. The high priest's eyebrows came up. Purchase you? Edric's glare persisted, yet he wouldn't repeat the question. Relaxing his expression, the high priest shook his head.
My name is Echelon Hampton, High Priest of the One Priesthood and loyal servant of the Goddess of Holy Light. It would be against everything she stands for to exchange coin for another human's life, and King Urchinwine banned slavery in the Midlands years ago.
What's legal and what isn't? Doesn't matter, Edric rebutted, gritting his teeth as he inhaled a ragged breath. So just answer the damned question. Echelon chuckled.
Very well. I can see your loyalty will require complete transparency. No, I do not dabble in purchasing or selling humans, nor does anyone else within my organization. I believe you to be part of a vision, but I shall explain it further once you have recovered, if you allow us to take you to our village.
Edric barked a laugh. Ha! Vision!
Give us a chance, son,
Echelon insisted. Silence settled for a moment as Edric considered his answer. He looked at both of them, his gaze lingering on Adina. She seemed much less enthusiastic about the prospect of bringing him along, but she clearly trusted the high priest's judgment. Fine. My name's Edric, and I'll... Come. Just don't touch me. Echelon held his hands up.
We shall only help you should you ask. Now, let us continue the journey. I want us to reach the temple village before sunset.
Chapter 10. The Goddess. Despite his best efforts, Edric had not managed to stay awake for the journey. He was getting increasingly jaded with waking up in a new place, this time being no different. The only redeeming factors in this instance were the soft bed underneath him and the warmth his room provided. Sitting up, Edric looked about the space. The building was timbered, with a window on either end and a single door leading out. He noted the furniture, a wardrobe, a fireplace, and a set of table and chairs. Then saw the food upon the table, his stomach rumbling at the mouth-watering sight. He jumped off the bed, darting for the edibles. They included bread, cheese, dried meat, and fruit, some of which were things he rarely, if ever, had eaten. Without a second thought, and ravenous as a wolf, he devoured the entire lot as fast as he could. He never even bothered to sit down, afraid he might stop himself if he were allowed to rethink his decision. Draining a large cup of water, Edric dropped it back down, then rounded the table and placed a soft hand on the window shutters. He creaked one side open as quietly as the hinges allowed. He could see more timbered houses outside, but also plenty of trees. Was the village in the middle of a forest? A road of packed dirt and gravel ran up to the cottages. Priests dressed in simple robes walked in and out of the dwellings, some seated on the front steps, others hanging up washed clothes on lines suspended between the trees. Evening. The sun is setting, Edric thought. Just as well. He searched the floor for his boots and found them by the door beside a small pile of his belongings, his belt with a few pouches attached to it, a sheathed knife, and his black mask. He wouldn't need those for a bit of meaningless exploring. Pulling the boots on, he moved for the rear window. He might have agreed upon coming here, but he wasn't about to flaunt his presence to a bunch of dress-wearing devouts. Pushing the shutters open, Edric bounded over the windowsill, landing on the soft forest floor beyond.
I had a feeling you might come out this side,
a gruff voice sounded. Edric spun, shuffling a step back. A robust man, around 6 feet tall, was leaning on the timbered wall, his arms corded with muscle. He seemed to be in his 30s, with brown eyes and neatly kept hair and beard, both blonde. Dressed in a grey linen shirt and a matching pair of trousers, he looked distinctly different from the priests Edric had seen at the front of the cottage. Resisting the urge to run, Edric inhaled deeply, forcing back the building discomfort of the other man's presence.
"The High Priest wished to summon you," the man continued. "I'm Senior Priest Caden Reed. I take it you have eaten?"
Edric frowned. "Why?" Caden shrugged.
"Simply because the High Priest wants you to be rested and fed. Otherwise, you won't regain your strength."
Standing silently for a moment, he eyed the youth.
"And you look like you might need it."
Tightening his fists, Edric glared at him. I don't need your sympathy." There was no reaction to be had, as Caden merely held his gaze.
"I certainly do not feel pity for the boy who was taken from the gutters and placed upon the most blessed grounds in the country."
Turning on his heel, he began walking away.
"Come on then, lad. The High Priest awaits you."
The walk to the High Priest's mansion took longer than expected. The village, albeit small in its number of inhabitants, was spread out within the forest, the trees only cleared away along the road and certain areas of the settlement. At the very heart of the village was a massive square. Circled by various-sized cottages, it also abutted what was likely the most essential structure of all, the temple. Unlike regular churches, the building reached so high that the bell tower barely rose above the rest, and the front held equally tall windows and a pair of massive double doors. Built from stone, the temple was enormous, dwarfing all other structures, with a nave designed much broader than the average house of worship. Walking past the temple, Caden led Edric down a road flanked by the temple gardens on one side and an expansive park on the other. There were winding paths, flower beds, ponds, and statues. The grounds seemed as if part of a regular settlement, only with a more religious theme to its design. A grand mansion stood tall beyond the temple gardens, which seemed to be Caden and Edric's destination. As they entered the home, guards stood stationed in every corner of the initial foyer. They were dressed in split combat robes, holding onto spears or resting their hands atop the hilts of sheathed blades. Following Caden at a safe distance, Edric crossed the hallway and entered a room at the back. He stopped just far enough inside for the door to close, then leaned up against the wall. In silence, he surveyed his surroundings, the space fitted with a massive fireplace at one end and bookshelves spread alongside the other. The furnishings included a couple of armchairs and a desk and chair placed below the only window. Edina stood beside the desk, with Ekelon seated behind it, and a young girl was perched on a stool near the window. She was no more than 10 years old, with chestnut hair and a pair of intense green eyes. She stared back at Edric, but remained silent.
"Welcome, my sons,"
Ekelon greeted them, motioning towards the armchairs.
"Have a seat."
Caden followed his command, but Edric remained at the door. "I'd rather stand," he muttered.
"Very well," Ekelon agreed. "I asked for you to come so that you may be introduced to those who will be closest to you should you decide to stay."
Edric looked at each of the gathered, but said nothing.
"You have already met Edina,"
Ekelon went on.
"She is a senior priest, an officer of the priesthood, and will train you alongside Anaya in the arts of the light."
He nodded towards the girl at the back.
"Caden, whom you have now also met, will be your second tutor." "Aye, for a combat training,"
Caden supplied. "I already know how to fight," Edric hissed, eyes like slits. Caden merely shrugged.
"One is never fully taught, lad."
Weaving his arms over his chest, Edric felt the ribs aching again, but he refused to show it. He looked elsewhere, failing to answer. Ekelon rose, rounded his desk, then leaned up against it.
The rest of you may leave, now once introductions have been made. I intend to speak with Edric alone.
But, Your Holiness, Adina began, yet he only raised his hand.
Do as I say,
he reaffirmed, watching as she walked past, Anaya in tow. Caden joined them, bowing courteously before removing himself. Shifting his weight, Edric felt his heart racing. Sweat broke out as the door closed behind the others.
You need not worry, my son,
Ekelon told him, as if aware of his strife.
I only have a few questions. First, I would like to know how old you are.
Edric moistened his lips. I don't know. 15? Or maybe 16?
Then 16 it shall be,
Ekelon decided.
Second, what is your surname?
Opening his mouth to reply, Edric suddenly found no words. He hadn't heard his surname in so many years that the question took him by surprise. I've never really had one. I only know what my mother used to tell people.
Which was?
Ramsay.
Very good, Edric Ramsay,
Ekelon grinned.
As part of the priesthood, you will receive the already mentioned training, the arts of the light, combat skills, healing, and demonology. Do you read?
I know how to, but I'm not very proficient.
That will be added then. I promise that your training shall be done at whatever pace you see fit. We are not about to force upon you exercises you do not feel comfortable with. I only want to know more about you. So, where are you from?
Edric's expression hardened. Why do you care? Does it matter? By your own account, you've already taken me in.
Because I wish to learn about my priests and disciples as a way of improving whatever guidance I can offer. You need not tell me things you find disconcerting. However, I will point out that whatever is said in this room will stay here.
Silence settled as Edric contemplated his words, his gaze dropping to the floor. I don't know where I'm from. Probably somewhere in the Midlands. Raven never had us travel far.
Your leader?
Yes. Ekelon gave him a nod of acknowledgement.
And before you joined his thieves' band?
Edric couldn't hold back a snort. Joined? Raven bought me from my mother when I was young, and I remember her, but not where we lived. I only have vague memories of the place. He expelled a breath, pushing the thoughts away. It doesn't matter anyway. She's dead.
I see, Ekelon said. Tell me about your profession. What did this Raven have you do?
Additional sweat erupted across Edric's body. He wrung his hands, still unable to look Ekelon in the eye. Everything.
Burglaries? Murders?
Ekelon paused, his voice lowering.
Rape?
Edric paled, his eyes wide as he finally met his gaze. No, never rape! Remaining calm, Ekelon yet again nodded.
But you have killed.
A knock on the door interrupted Edric as he was about to answer.
Do you need assistance, Your Holiness?
A muffled voice sounded from the hallway beyond.
No, stand down,
Ekelon replied, then returned his attention to Edric.
Well?
Edric heaved out a breath. Yes, but with such merits, why am I even here? What do you want with me? Ekelon shook his head.
We can speak of that at a later date, son. It is not important as of yet. I suggest you rest for the night, since it is getting late. Join us in the temple as the bell tolls in the morning for prayers, after which we shall speak more.
Pursing his lips, Edric stepped away from the wall. Fine, but I'll need an explanation.
And you will have one, only not at this point in time. For now, I want you to focus on recovering, so that you might come to enjoy your stay here with the priesthood.
It was early in the morning as Catrin traversed the square outside the temple. The space brimmed with priests all awaiting the morning prayers to commence. Catrin was meant to attend, but something had come to his attention only moments before, and he needed to discuss the matter with the high priest. He headed for Ekelon's mansion, passed the guards with a curt nod, then walked through to the drawing room.
Your Holiness!
Catrin bowed deeply.
I need a word with you.
Seated at his desk, Ekelon closed his book of scriptures.
What about, my son? There was a break-in during the night. A break-in? Where? The pantry building, Your Holiness.
A bemused smile spread across Ekelon's face.
The pantry? So food has been stolen? Aye,
Catrin confirmed.
And I have a feeling I know who did it. I do too.
Catrin weaved his arms across his chest.
He will be a hard nut to crack, Your Holiness.
Ekelon clasped his hands.
Indeed, although that was not entirely unexpected. I am sure you are up to the task. Aye, but he lacks trust in us. He even jumped out the back window yesterday instead of using his own front door. Without trust, there is not much we can do. And this is not the average youth you've taken in. Perhaps you had better explain to him how life works in this village, because he'll undoubtedly make enemies otherwise. The cook was fuming this morning.
Ekelon's laughter rippled out.
I can imagine she was.
Catrin held back a smirk.
Your Holiness, with all due respect, if this boy is as special as you say, then perhaps you should tell him. Make him understand there is more to this existence than merely living day to day. He needs to have a little more foresight. You are correct,
Ekelon granted, pushing his chair back. Rising, he gestured towards the door.
You may leave. Tell the priests that the prayers might be somewhat delayed. I will go to Edric directly.
Ekelon received no answer as he knocked on the door to Edric's cottage. The youth was the only one to reside within, so he either slept or refused to pay heed to the high priest's beckon. Ignoring the lack of answer, Ekelon breached the doorway, stepping inside. It was open through to Edric's bedroom, the unused bed visible from the entry. A coldness dropped into Ekelon's stomach. Had he left? Hurrying into the bedroom, Ekelon ground to a halt, finding Edric seated on the floor in the corner furthest away from the door. He had his back against the wall, his pouch-lined belt wrapped around his waist. Cradling his sheathed knife on his lap, he stared at the high priest below blonde bangs.
I heard you broke into the pantry, son.
Still bemused at the notion, Ekelon forced himself to keep a straight face.
I realize I failed to tell you that breakfast is served for all inhabitants. You need not steal food, nor anything else for that matter. We supply everything you might need. Food, water, clothing, books, weaponry, mounts, everything.
I've no coin, Edric mumbled, barely discernible. Crossing the room, Ekelon sat down on the bed.
I apologize, Edric. I have not made myself clear to you. All that we supply is free of charge.
Eyes narrowing, Edric looked at him intently.
Free? Yes. This is a community where each of us works together in communion to supply everything needed for our daily lives. That also means there is enough for everyone to live and thrive, including you.
That just sounds like another form of payment, Edric challenged. So what do you want from me?
Whatever your skills can provide. If you can heal, then heal. If you can fight, then fight. If you can hunt, then hunt. Do whatever you believe will be beneficial. Nothing more is asked of you.
I can hunt.
Excellent. Then whenever you have become accustomed to your new home, it shall be your first task.
Ekelon patted the bed beside him.
Part of which will be that you start using your bed.
Edric removed his gaze. I wasn't sure. It was mine.
Everything you see in this room is yours, my son, although I ask of you not to break anything if you can avoid it. Firewood is stacked outside, but you will have to refill the pile yourself. You already know where the food is, and meals are served 3 times daily. Next to the pantry building is the infirmary, where you can go should you ever need healing. Clothing can be washed in a stream to the east, and horses are available at our stable, only south of here. We hold morning prayers in the temple every morning at
He halted, throwing a glance over his shoulder out the window.
Right about now, but you will hear the bell.
Acknowledging his words, Edric sat in silence. He fiddled with the knife but left it sheathed.
I need to know why you brought me here. It doesn't make sense to me.
Very well. I wanted to wait so that you may regain faith in the goddess, but, alas, I believe we are already at a crossroads. You see, the goddess has long granted me visions. They are not always clear, however, which means they are open to interpretation. Nevertheless, she bestowed upon me the vision of a blond boy hanging at the end of a rope above a crevice. I could not make out his face as it was veiled in mist, but I know what she told me. The redeemed will champion the light, bringing an end to true evil. I believe the redeemed to be you, Edric, and that you will aid us in our war against the darkness.
Edric huffed.
Oh, this vision again. Am I supposed to believe that?
Believe what you will,
Echelon simply replied.
You asked, and I answered.
A long silence stretched between them as they looked at each other.
So I'm just meant to become one of you? Edric eventually asked. Turn into this redeemed and pretend like my life never happened?
No, not act as if it never happened, but allow yourself to move on.
Springing to his feet, Edric scowled at him, his voice rising.
You've known me for less than a day, and you ask me to somehow forget everything that has ever happened to me, and replace it with some stupid fairy tale about bringing darkness to an end? How dumb do you think I am?
What has happened, Edric?
Echelon's question hung in the air.
Will you tell me?
Edric shuffled away from him, his back pressing against the wall.
No!
A pleasant smile settled on Echelon's lips.
Well, in the end, it matters not what life throws at you, only how you allow those events to affect you. And the goddess has most certainly bestowed her blessings upon you.
Choking on his breath, Edric feigned a laugh.
Blessings? Not once has the goddess shown me kindness, not once!
Echelon lifted a hand, gesturing at the youth and their surroundings.
Yet here you stand.
Flinging the sheath aside, Edric shot forward, knife extended. The blade end stopped inches short of the high priest's face, yet he hadn't even blinked. Cursing, Edric flung the weapon onto the floor. His eyes watered, his expression twisting into grief as he screamed,
Stupid old fool! How can you just sit there like nothing?
Because I do not believe you to be evil, Edric,
Echelon said, his unwavering voice akin to that of a calm breeze in a raging storm.
It is all a matter of trust, son. Trust. You must learn to give as well as receive. Give us a chance and we shall supply the same for you in return.
Shoulders dropping, Edric stepped back again, then sank to the floor.
I can't.
You can, Echelon asserted, rising from the bed. Give us, and the goddess, time.
Not awaiting Edric's reply, he moved for the door.
The morning prayers will commence soon. Do join us. Be a part of our community. You can decide later whether you wish to stay or not. I only stress that decisions should always be made when informed, not when gripped by fear.
Chapter 11. The Colour of Steel. Edric pulled his already buttoned shirt over his head, letting the grey linen flutter down his body. Lighter colours had become his favoured choice, staying clear of the black he had worn for so many years as part of the haunted shadows. The paler shades gave a sense of comfort, as if he had taken yet another step away from a lifetime of crime. All of his old belongings had been shoved into the bottom of his wardrobe, never to be used again, or so he hoped. He only glanced at the closet, then looked down at his hands. Tugging at the sleeves, Edric was satisfied with the size of the shirt. It felt good, much better than his previous round of tailored clothes. People were not lying. He had indeed grown larger in his years with the priesthood. That's what proper sustenance and physical exercise do to you, he supposed, scratching at the back of his head. His training had been relentless. Adina might not have been the most accepting of Edric's presence, but she had never denied him guidance, and Cadin was persistent beyond belief. Together, they had taught him to fight in ways he never thought possible, shown him the miracles of healing, and taken him on demon hunts into the deepest and darkest reaches of the Midlands. He had worked alongside many others, not in the least with Adina's other disciple, Anaya. Another pleasant change for Edric was the fact that none within the priesthood seemed interested in harming him, so he felt relatively safe around the priests. But no friends were ever made. He shook his head, tightening the belt of his leather trousers. Never friends. Looking back, Edric found it hard to believe he had joined the morning prayers that morning, almost 4 years earlier. He had felt like the biggest hypocrite in the room, but had sat there for the entire sermon, listening to the high priest as he had spoken of the goddess and her greatness. However, Edric was yet to be convinced of the validity of Ekelon's so-called vision, and that he was indeed a champion of the light. Sure, Edric had learned to wield the light, fighting against demons, but in no way was he exceptional, nor was there an end to the war in sight. Running a hand through his hair, Edric brushed the unruly strands away from his face. Disregarding the dishevelled sheets on his bed, he pushed his feet into a pair of knee-high boots, buckled the straps, then left his home. Summer was in full force, the heat of the sun permeating every nook and cranny, despite the early morning. Priests, dressed in their grey, black or brown robes, all filed along the streets, heading towards the temple. The bell would soon chime, another gathering for morning prayers commencing before the daily chores got underway. Hollers and shoutings suddenly reverberated off the many trees of the village, the noise startling Edric. The bellowing voices came from the south, somewhere close to the stables. Was the priesthood under attack? Returning to his bedroom, Edric swiftly collected his quiver, haphazardly throwing it over his shoulder, then grabbed his bow. He bolted out the door, leaving it swinging on its hinges. More priests joined him, charging down the road towards the intensifying shouts. The sight of a massive steel grey horse, its broad hooves stomping ferociously, had everyone stop in their tracks. It thrashed and kicked, neighing a scream at its captors, Cadin and a few trembling stable hands. The beast whipped back a final time, and Cadin lost his grip on the lead, the rope swinging wildly as the horse snapped and snorted. A stable hand was kicked to the ground before the horse finally fled up the road, heading for Edric and the other onlookers. They all threw themselves aside as the beast stampeded past. It cut right, heading eastwards into the forest and towards the nearby stream. Throwing his weaponry aside, Edric took off in a sprint, pursuing the horse. The animal seemed young, massive in size, but not yet padded with the muscles of an adult. The wispy tail swirled behind its haunches as it galloped, cutting onto a trail leading north. The horse's direction had it heading for a pond upstream, where the forest met the mountain into an inevitably abrupt stop. Running behind the animal, Edric could already hear the waterfall churning, rolling like distant thunder. They were getting close. Hooves clattered against stone and undergrowth, the horse sending sticks and leaves into the air in its mad flight to reach the rising mountainside. It whinnied, circled around, then started back down the path it came, charging straight for Edric. With barely a second to react, Edric held his arms out wide, blocking the way between two trees. He swallowed, waiting for the collision as his face suddenly got sprayed with a mix of twigs and dried leaves. The horse halted, its hooves anchoring to the forest floor. It snorted, whipping its head back, the lead hanging from its bridle, dangling from side to side. It was no wonder the horse had looked so dark. The grey coat was almost fully covered in dirt and mud. The mane was matted, and its hooves lacked the characteristic nails around the edges, likely bereft of shoes. Edric slowly brought his arms down, hushing the panicked animal. As its movements lessened in intensity, the dark legs still, Edric chanced to step forward. Ears flat against its skull, the horse matched his movements, retreating. Remaining silent, Edric held his hands out. There wasn't much time, as he could hear footsteps approaching from behind. Catrin and the stable hands were gaining on them. "Calm," he whispered to the horse, moving ever so slightly towards it. This time, the beast stayed in place, ears twitching. It snorted again, a front hoof digging up the ground. Licking his lips, Edric exhaled. "Shh, I won't hurt you." As he took another step, the footfalls behind him ceased, replaced with a few words spoken in a low voice. He couldn't make out what was said, but at least Catrin and his men had stopped. Inhaling another breath, Edric reached out, his fingertips brushing against the horse's muzzle. He had expected the animal to snap at him, or at least back away, but it did neither. Hot air blew from the horse's nostrils as it looked back at him. Cautiously moving closer, Edric placed his other hand onto the horse's head, softly stroking the dark coat. The hairs were salted, white speckling the grey fur. Everyone stood as if frozen in place, watching the scene before them. Edric received a nudge, the horse nuzzling against his chest, nibbling at his shirt. Scratching its chin, Edric took the opportunity to retrieve the lead rein, wrapping it once around his wrist.
"Well done,"
Catrin praised from behind him. Edric glanced across his shoulder at the others, the group standing only a few paces away. "I didn't do anything." He felt a tug on the rope, the horse lifting its head at Catrin's continued approach.
"I will not come any closer."
"Best not," Edric agreed, hushing the horse to calm it again. Hands on his hips, Catrin tilted his head.
"I must say I am impressed. That colt is the least friendly I have ever bred. He's 3 years old, but you are the first to handle him."
Walking up to stand beside the horse, Edric ran his hand down its flank. "I guessed he was young."
"Aye, and not exactly well trained."
Regarding them for a moment, Catrin cupped his chin.
"You can keep him, if you want."
Edric blanched. "Keep him?"
"Aye, to use as your personal steed. It's either that or we put him down, but I would hate for that to happen."
Catrin released a cheerless chuckle.
"He is the result of a quite expensive matchmaking, and I would rather not give up on him."
"Fine," Edric grunted, his fingers wrapped tightly around the lead. "I'll see what I can do." A smile bloomed on Catrin's face.
"Good. With a bit of luck, we might be able to castrate him soon enough."
Unconvinced, Edric blew out a breath. Perhaps. Dust swirled into the air, dirt trickling down onto the straw-covered floor of the stable box. The grey horse shifted, but seemed content, taking another mouthful of hay from the feeding trough. Edric worked his way around the animal, diligently cleaning the coat. More and more of the dappled fur came through, giving way to a shimmering pattern as striking as the night sky. The morning prayers were long since forgotten. Edric wasn't even sure he had heard the bell, but it wasn't the first time he had missed the sermon, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. Grabbing a hoof-pick, Edric ran a soft hand down the horse's front leg, cautious not to startle the animal. With a firm but gentle grip, he raised the hoof, then scraped the sole, removing debris and matted straw. Catrin had been ecstatic at this unforeseen development, and he had already sent for the farrier. They hoped he would arrive the same afternoon.
"So, Catrin was not exaggerating."
A pleased voice sounded from the stable entrance. Edric shot up, turning on the spot. His jaw slacking, he sucked in a breath. Echelon walked through the central path of the stables, his black robes fluttering over the dirt floor. Carrying a broad smile, he gestured towards the horse.
"If you ever wanted a good reason to miss prayers, this would be one of them."
"I apologize, Your Holiness," Edric whispered. I lost track of time."
It matters not, my child.
Ekelon stopped a few feet from the box, watching them from afar.
Your very own horse. Such an honour.
Edric looked away, but struggled to settle his gaze. If you say so.
4 years soon,
Ekelon reminisced.
You have come a long way since the first day I brought you here.
Grunting, Edric nodded his agreement.
Will you stay?
Locking eyes with Ekelon, Edric hesitated. Stay?
Yes. I once asked you to give us a chance before you decided. I have never brought the subject back up, believing you, in time, would tell me. However, as things progress, I find myself curious as to your decision. So, will you stay?
Edric blinked, his throat dry. Even if he would never be forced to remain with the priesthood, the mere words, saying he wanted to be part of them, were as though glued to his tongue. The finality of his decision sent shivers down his arms and legs, numbing him to the core. The cheerful expression on Ekelon's face did not waver despite the silence that stretched between them. He respectfully waited, clasping his hands at the waist. A bump to Edric's arm saw him jump. He bumbled sideways, glaring back at the horse who had dared to push him. The animal snorted, grinning its teeth at him before returning to the feeding trough. Ekelon stifled his response, holding back from commenting. Edric began, but words still failed him. He brushed some dust from his trousers, taking a deep breath. Straightening himself, he came to his full height. I'll stay. Ekelon's eyes gleamed, his smile growing.
Excellent! I shall bring the news to the senior priests. Perhaps you will even come to accept our robes. Give the outfit a chance.
And become a dress-wearer? Edric retorted.
It is not a dress, Ekelon argued, still grinning despite his feigned offence. It is the official garment of the priesthood.
Edric shrugged, returning to tending to his horse. Who knows? Maybe I will, in another 4 or 5 years, or 10. You have been listening to The Redeemed, a prequel to The Light of Darkness, by Catrin Russell. Narrated by Jez Jameson. Music, The Beginning of Freedom, by Noel Malakar. Copyright and production copyright, Catrin Russell.